Chapter 513. My condition is SOSO. Charging my laptop keeps tripping at home. I'm very annoyed. Sorry. The banquet proceeded smoothly, at least on the surface, particularly after Fan Xixia accepted the pair of jade lions from Marquis Chang, and with a false smile. However, as the host, Fan Xixia habitually glanced out of the hall of Baoyue brothel. He had reserved the entire Baoyue brothel, so there were no other guests. Sitting beside him, Wei Hua furrowed his brows slightly and wondered who else was coming. Why hadn't he received any news beforehand? Looking at Fan Xixia's expression, one could imagine that the identity of the guests who were about to arrive was not low. Otherwise, he would not be unable to suppress his anticipation and nervousness. If the identity of the guests was not low, why had the banquet begun before the guests arrived? Wei Hua unconsciously shook his head. A self-mocking and bitter smile rose to the corners of his lips. He knew that he could not use common sense to judge these two brothers of the Fan family. He was now the commander of the provost of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard. He had taken over Xin Zhong's former position. Most of Northern Qi's special forces were under his control. The little Northern Qi emperor's trust in him could not be said to be weak. His power could not be said to be small. However, once he faced the Fan brothers from the south, Wei Hua still felt faintly nervous. Fan Xian was in charge of the Overwatch Council. He and Wei Hua were in the same line of business. However, Wei Hua knew that he had not delved into this line of work as long as Fan Xian had. The Northern Court's Brocade Guard also did not have as much power as the Southern Court's Overwatch Council. If the two of them actually fought across the border, he would not be a match for the other. As for Fan Xixia, Wei Hua looked at the chubby young man beside him who was entertaining the guests and furrowed his brows slightly. He had to admit that he had indeed misjudged this person 2 years ago. He had thought that Fan Xian was just using the power in his hands to send his brother to Northern Qi to escape. He had not thought that after a year Fan Xixia, hidden behind the scenes, had firmly controlled the old Chui family's routes. His secret business was also flourishing. This was completely not the business sensitivity and ability a young man should have. Wei Hua slapped his forehead. Smiling, he toasted Fan Xixia and cracked a few jokes. The purpose of Fan Xixia's invitation today was clear. The smuggled goods from the south had to be taken over by someone. They couldn't let a Qing man openly sell them in Northern Qi. In the past, it had always been the Wei clan, especially Chang Ningho, who had taken over. Now that Fan Xixia was becoming more and more daring, he felt that Chang Ningho's family was moving too slowly. That was why he had dragged Chang Anho in as well. Wei Hua did not dislike this arrangement. It was not because the Marquis of Chang'an was his uncle. Rather, he knew that the Wei family was just a puppet the emperor had placed in front of the stage. The majority of the profits flowed endlessly into the emperor's internal treasury through this business. Furthermore, no matter how much trouble Fan Xixia could cause, he was, after all, on Northern Qi territory. Wei Hua had enough power to keep an eye on him. Once things went wrong, the Brocade Guard could easily clean out all of Fan Xixia's businesses. It was just that Wei Hua wouldn't dare to do such a thing until things had reached the final step. He didn't even dare to ask for an imperial edict. Northern Qi needed the goods Fan Xian had spat out from the Qing palace treasury. Wei Hua was afraid of Fan Xian's sinister methods and his unreasonableness. The curtain at Baoyue brothel's door moved slightly. 2 girls entered together. Wei Hua's hand holding the wine cup shook and almost spilled it. He knew the 2 girls. This was also one of the reasons why Wei Hua had always been deeply afraid of Fan Xian. Haitang and Fan Ruoruo. Wei Hua stood to welcome them. He turned around and pretended to scold Fan Xixia a few times before inviting the 2 noble disciples of Tianyi Dao to sit at the main table. For a moment the scene was awkward. Everyone in Northern Qi knew that the Empress Dowager's intention was for Haitang to marry Wei Hua. However, Haitang and Fan Xian had some unclear relationship. Wei Hua laughed bitterly and said to Haitang, "Second young master Fan is inviting us. You really don't give me any face by coming like this." Haitang smiled and took the jade lion Fan Xixia handed to her. She fiddled with it and said, "You just like to talk." Wei Hua laughed and didn't say anything more. From a long time ago, he knew that this woman was not someone he could touch. When the Empress Dowager had first shown interest, the first thing he did was enter the palace to decline. However, it didn't have much effect. The Empress Dowager's love for her juniors was always unreasonable. The Empress Dowager was unreasonable, Fan Xian was unreasonable, and Wei Hua did not have the courage. This matter offended Fan Xian too much. Besides, if he married a 9th-level ace, how could he maintain his authority? Besides, although Haitang was intelligent, her looks were very average. Last year, Wei Hua's sister had followed Lang Qiao to Jiangnan. When they passed through Wuzhou, they had gotten into an argument. Wei Hua knew Fan Xian's petty personality and that he must be holding a grudge. He had no choice but to write a letter and say many good things before Fan Xian's anger subsided. As his thoughts drifted through the years, Wei Hua couldn't help but sigh. Fan Xian, you don't give me any face at all. You always push yourself down on everything. We are in the same line, so why are you in such a rush to destroy each other? As the commander of the Brocade Guard, why was he not as happy as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Ever since Haitang and Fan Ruoruo entered Baoyue Brothel, the banquet in the hall became much quieter. The shrewd and ruthless elders of the Wei family put on the airs of elders and chatted with the two girls. In their hearts, they were thinking that they had originally wanted to help the emperor get more benefits in this negotiation. Now that these two had arrived, particularly Haitang, where were her arms and elbows born? Thus their attacks on Fan Xizha slowed down. Fan Xizha's expression was calm as he spoke with a slight smile. In their casual conversation, he clearly explained the division of profits in the coming year and the details of the handover. He had Haitang and her sister come today to give himself a bargaining chip. At least he wanted to mess up the hearts of the Northern Qi people. Nominally, it was his negotiation with the Wei family. In reality, although not everyone at the banquet knew about Fan Xian and the Northern Qi Emperor's shady dealings, Chang Ningho and his son, who led the Wei family, knew. After 3 rounds of wine, the discussion ended. Both sides parted happily. However, Wei Hua's expression was not very happy. It was clear that in this new round of agreement on dividing the spoils, Fan Xizha had still taken the lion's share. The night gradually darkened. Haitang held the warm jade lion and glanced at Fan Xizha with a not-quite-there smile. She then left, leaving Baoyue Brothel to the siblings. I don't like Haitang, Fan Xizha said with a furrowed brows in a room in the Jingdo branch of Baoyue Brothel. You're becoming more and more old and heavy. Fan Ruoruo patted her brother's head out of habit and smiled slightly. What's wrong with sister? Don't tell me you still hold a grudge against me for using you like a donkey? Fan Xizha shook his head and said, that was brother's intention. He wanted me to suffer. I understand. Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother with some surprise. Tilting her head, she said, you're truly becoming more and more old. You're not like a child at all. Fan Xizha smiled self-mockingly and said, in a place like this, there's no one I can trust. There's nothing I can do if I don't want to be careful. Right, sister, you said old? His spirit suddenly rose and he asked, are you saying that I'm becoming more and more like brother? Fan Xizha asked excitedly. In his heart, his older brother was his life's idol. If he could get closer to his older brother's image, naturally he would be more pleased. Fan Ruoruo covered her smile and said, you're becoming more and more like father. It looks like father's beating you back then did have some effect. She paused and then said, earlier you said you didn't like sister Haitang. What? Fan Xizha looked quietly into his sister's eyes and didn't speak for a moment. Fan Ruoruo also looked at him calmly. Sister, you should understand, Fan Xizha said seriously. We already have a sister-in-law. Fan Ruoruo's brows also furrowed. She sighed and said, yes. Fan Xizha furrowed his brows and thought for a moment. In a quiet voice he said, actually, you don't even know that during this year sister-in-law has written me many letters. Fan Ruoruo was slightly startled and asked, what did she say in the letters? What could she say? It's just how the family is, how father is, and how mother is. Fan Xizha sighed. My brother-in-law is alone in a foreign country. Of course, sister-in-law is worried. To tell the truth, during this year, whenever I have something I don't understand, I don't want to go and trouble brother. It's all sister-in-law who helped me think of ideas. Fan Ruoruo gradually digested the shock in her heart. This was also the first time she had heard of this matter. She thought about it for a moment and tasted many flavors. She sadly said, sister-in-law is a very pitiful person. As you know, the eldest princess is currently imprisoned by the emperor in a side courtyard, and brother is in Jiangnan. Brother only knows how to kick me to the north. Fan Xizha's tone carried dissatisfaction. Fan Xizha sounded dissatisfied. Even though I know he's training me, has he ever thought about how young I am? Such a big mess, how could I manage it? I only know how to let go. How could I be as thorough as you think? Fan Ruoruo furrowed her brows and scolded, it's not easy for brother in the south. If it wasn't for him standing firm, how could you stand firm in the north? How is he letting go? The shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall are all secretly helping you. The Overwatch Council's network in Northern Qi is also serving you. In order to raise you, he has put a lot of effort. As for training, it's not like you don't know what kind of person brother is. He grew up alone in Danzhou. I don't know what kind of person he has gone through to get to where he is today. This is what he believes in. This is how he treats himself. We are his brothers and sisters. Of course he would also choose this method. After a string of scoldings, it was as if Fan Xizha had returned to Jingdo a few years ago. At that time he who was not afraid of heaven or earth, was only afraid of the iron ruler in his sister's hand. In an instant he softened. A moment later he muttered, "In any case, I don't like Haitang." Fan Ruoruo sighed and said, "It's not like you don't know how much Haitang has helped brother in secret. It's just an exchange of benefits. Other than the dead Zhuang Mohan, how many people in northern Qi are truly saints who do not care about worldly matters?" Fan Xizha smiled coldly. "Don't look at how you've entered Kuhi's tutelage and how I'm the #1 boss. If brother is no longer useful to northern Qi, I'm afraid we will immediately be stepped on. At that time I don't expect Haitang to stick up for us." Fan Ruoruo said seriously, "My view is the opposite of yours." Fan Xizha shook his head and faintly said a moment later, "No matter what, there has to be a first come, first served, right?" Fan Ruoruo thought deeply for a long time and slowly nodded. She also felt great pity for her respectable and amiable sister-in-law, who was used to being silent and hurt. She agreed with her brother's view. Suddenly, an absurd thought welled up in her heart. If it was said first come, first served, shouldn't she be the first to reach brother's side? It was just that fate played tricks on her. A trace of bitterness rose to the corner of her lips. Shortly after, she suppressed this undeserved emotion and worried with her brother about Lin Wanner's fate. Brother is definitely not someone who is fickle and indifferent. It's just that now sister-in-law is stuck between the eldest princess and brother. She really doesn't know what to do. Don't think so much. Fan Xizha shrugged. Right now, the most important problem is brother's situation in the south. I saw that you had a large banquet tonight and thought you'd already forgotten yourself. The eldest princess has fallen. Naturally, I have to use this opportunity to earn more money, Fan Xizha said. But right now, only brother's faction is powerful in the court. I just feel that there will be some problems. Perhaps you're thinking too far ahead. It's not exactly powerful, but it's standing at the edge of the wind. Fan Ruoruo smiled slightly. Regardless of whether it's family affairs or national affairs, it doesn't seem to be something that people like us who are guests in a foreign land can worry about. Fan Xizha was startled. Given his sister's usual attitude, he thought she should be very worried about Fan Xian's safety. Why did she appear so indifferent? But he didn't dare to criticize his sister. He unconsciously asked, "Whose poem?" "Brother. Didn't he compose a poem? He doesn't do it in front of outsiders." We really don't care. What can we worry about?" Fan Ruoruo's calm expression carried a sense of confidence in her brother. He worked so hard to send us to northern Qi because he doesn't want us to be involved in these matters. If we really want to do what's best for him, then we must live well here and not make him worry. How do you live well? Is it happy being a boss? It's okay, although sometimes it's a bit troublesome. I'm going to the medical shop tomorrow. I also feel that this kind of life is very happy. Brother said that people live in this world to find things they like to do. Chapter 5:14. June 1st. I wish everyone a happy holiday. A new month is a new beginning. Looking back at last month, it was truly a series of difficult things. This story is also very difficult. My condition has entered the worst period. I have held on, but there are still a few chapters that were poorly written, including yesterday's chapter. I am truly sorry. I am satisfied with the chapters before and after the thunderstorm, but I still have some regrets. In my original fantasies I should have written better. I should have been able to do better, so I continue to apologize. I don't know how much I can write this month because it really is something. I will do my best to ensure that it is at least 130,000 words. Last month I took third place in the monthly votes. This is my best ranking since I posted my book online. I received a total of 6,000 yuan in prize money. I sincerely thank everyone for your support. Please continue to support the lazy but serious me. Thank you. From Jiangnan Road to Jiangbei Road, there were 3 convenient routes. No matter which one they took, they would always have to cross the mighty river. In the present world, there were no concrete bridges that Fan Xian was familiar with. There was only the endless stream of ferries between the two sides to support the busy waterside traffic. The three large workshops of the palace treasury were in North Min, the transport company Yamen was in Suzhou, and Sir Fan Jr. was in Hangzhou. It appeared that the palace treasury's control was loose. Only the officials and merchants who had the opportunity to come into contact with this portion of the palace treasury knew how strict the control over the warehouses and special routes throughout Jiangnan was after the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury Yamen worked together. In particular, the route to the north purposely took a turn to the west. From Shazhou it crossed the river to the north, then crossed the barren mountains of Jiangbei Road, the meadows of Cangzhou Road, and then circled around the North Sea. It endlessly sent into northern Qi territory and brought back rich silver for the Qing kingdom to purchase other needs. Most of the goods heading north were under Xia Mingji's control. With Fan Xian's help, Xia Qifei placed a few large bids and secretly consolidated the small businesses and gangs in the Jiangnan area. He had gradually become powerful. In the eyes of the officials, the reason he chose to cross the river in Shazhou was because the Jiangnan Navy was stationed there. Only Fan Xian and he knew that Shazhou was chosen because the Jiangnan water bandits had the strongest power there. Although the palace treasury goods could be sent by the court to supervise the delivery, he looked at the ship's transporting goods on the smooth river and narrowed his eyes slightly. Xia Qifei sat in a tea shop outside the city gate of Shazhou. Increased his appetite for goods, but it was not to the extent that he could not accept them. After all, the doors of the palace treasury were completely open to Fan Xian's trusted aides. However, to send all the goods there in such a short amount of time, and at the same time not raise the court's suspicions, required careful planning. Fortunately, according to court practice, the Overwatch Council was responsible for supervising the operation of the palace treasury. Now, the worries of the officials in the court had finally become reality. Fan Xian monitored himself. How could there not be a problem? Xia Qifei put down the teacup and slowly savored the bitter taste in his mouth. However, there was not a trace of bitterness in his heart. Looking back on this year and a half, he sometimes felt like he was dreaming. Ever since he climbed onto the imperial envoy's thigh, the family grudge that had bitten his heart for over a decade like a poisonous snake had been resolved in one day. The Ming family had once again returned to his hands. His identity had also changed from the shady head of the Jiangnan water bandits to an official of the Overwatch Council and a wealthy merchant whose name shook Jiangnan. The matters of this world were indeed somewhat wondrous. However, he also knew that the present Ming family was no longer the Ming family of the past. Although the court had not directly interfered, if Sir Fan Jr. truly gave the order, he could only follow it completely. Thinking of this, he pulled back his satisfied gaze from the boxes of goods in the boats on the river and furrowed his brows slightly. There were some things he did not understand. Smuggling palace treasury goods to northern Qi and Dongyi was, without question, the most profitable business in the world. Given Sir Fan Jr.'s identity, why was he so greedy? Sir Fan Jr. had once explained that the reason the eldest princess was greedy for silver was because she wanted to seek power in court, pave the foundations for the princes, and buy people's hearts in the military. However, Sir Fan Jr. was a prince. After he returned to the Fan family, it was impossible for him to take over the throne. What did he need so much silver for? Furthermore, the emperor had not liked the eldest princess secretly emptying out his palace treasury. Would the emperor allow Sir Fan Jr. to do this now? Ever since the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, lost power, this not too big or too small shock wave lightly swept through the hearts of the nobles under heaven and did not stir up any more waves. Of course, this was only the calm on the surface. No one knew exactly what the people were thinking in secret. However, everyone now knew how deeply the powerful official in the Qing court, Fan Xian, was favored and trusted by the Qing emperor and how much power he held in his hands. Inevitably, the crowd grew wary and hopeful. No matter what was said, in the hearts of the people under heaven, Fan Xian was still a scholar. His performance on the stage these few years made it clear to everyone that he was different from the other noble sons of the Qing kingdom. He was not as hot-blooded and belligerent. Naturally, northern Qi and Dongyi hoped that Fan Xian would last a long time. No matter how much the northern Qi emperor wanted to pull Fan Xian to his side as a prince, he knew that Fan Xian staying in the Qing kingdom would benefit him the most. He hoped that Fan Xian would have as much power as possible and as much favor as possible. It would be best if he was powerful enough to influence the Qing emperor's decisions. However, this was only an extravagant hope and idealism. No emperor would be stupid enough to place his hopes of peace on an official of a foreign country. The peace between countries was, in the end, reflected in power. The power of a country was military power. Since the beginning of spring in the vast wilderness to the north of Yanjing and east of Cangzhou, Northern Qi's mighty general Shang Shanhu, had been released from house arrest and landed on the southern front. In a short amount of time he established his absolute authority in the military. He began daily military drills, maintaining a powerful deterrent to the Qing army and suppressing the ambitions of the Qing people. Directly opposing Shang Shanhu was a general of the Qing kingdom, northern governor Yan Xiaoyi. When these two powerful people collided, how could there not be some sparks and the smell of blood gradually rising? Although there was no fighting on the border, there were some small scuffles and purposely created tense atmosphere. Gradually the air began to fill. Xia Mingji, which Xia Qifei was in charge of transporting palace treasury goods to the north, had to make a detour to the northern sea south of Cangzhou because the situation in Cangzhou had always been tense. However, all of this had completely changed this month. For some reason, Shang Shanhu had suddenly pulled back his troops 50 li to the north and moved his troops. He adopted a lazy posture of neither defending nor advancing. It was as if he did not care that Yan Xiaoyi was leading 100,000 elite soldiers in the area between Yanjing and Cangzhou. He stared like a bull wanting to come up and take a bite at any moment. Tension suddenly became leisure. The display of power between the two countries suddenly became an outing. The instantaneous change made the Qing military feel an inexplicable anger and shock. What exactly were the northern Qi people thinking? Yan Xiaoyi knew what the northern Qi people were thinking. He picked up his cup and drank a mouthful of the strong alcohol produced on the grasslands further north of the northern sea. The alcohol wetted his beard slightly. The cold light in his eyes gradually grew. Ever since the news from Jingdou had reached Cangzhou, Yan Xiaoyi knew he was facing a crisis. When his trusted aide lowered his voice and suggested ideas at night, he remained calm and didn't say a word. When Shang Shanhu led the northern Qi army and slowly withdrew, he assumed the posture of a naked woman reclining on the couch. Yan Xiaoyi was not surprised or confused. He only smiled coldly. The northern Qi people also knew of the eldest princess' loss of power and knew that the emperor would certainly take him down. Thus, Shang Shanhu purposely showed weakness and removed all the pressure he had placed on Yan Xiaoyi so that he could preserve all of his strength and spirit. What was the point of preserving this? Naturally, it was to deal with their own emperor. Yan Xiaoyi slowly put down his wine cup. A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. If the northern Qi emperor suddenly wanted to act against Shang Shanhu, he would also do the same. There were internal problems in the enemy country. As his own side, he had to stand by and watch and give the enemy as much space and power as possible. Only in this way could the other side struggle themselves. After they killed each other, he could sit back and reap the benefits. It could not be said to be unpleasant. However, Yan Xiaoyi didn't seem to have made any preparations. It was as if he was just waiting for that day. He was waiting for a few old and wrinkled eunuchs to come on horseback, exhausted, shouting themselves hoarse and with faces full of terror. Yet, they forced themselves to be calm and announced the emperor's edict to him. Yan Xiaoyi, wait, the eldest princess had fallen. As the eldest princess trusted aid and her greatest support in the army, the emperor would not allow him to continue to control the elite soldiers of the Northern Expedition Army. Yan Xiaoyi knew this very well. He had already made preparations, so he didn't see the anger on his trusted aide's face. However, contrary to his expectations, the emperor's edict had yet to arrive. Worry floated onto his face. He thought to himself, just what kind of crime does the emperor want to lay on me for it to take so long? The strong wine burned his heart. It burned Yan Xiaoyi's heart. Did the emperor really trust him that much? The emperor knew that he had been nothing more than a hunter in the mountains. If it hadn't been for the eldest princess, he would probably have been unknown for his entire life. Furthermore, Fan Xian had killed his son. Although Yan Xiaoyi had never found evidence, he believed that within the Qing kingdom, other than the emperor, there were only two crazy people who dared to kill his son. The emperor could not kill his illegitimate child to avenge his son. Crazy Fan Xian. This was the biggest irreconcilable conflict between Yan Xiaoyi and the emperor. Yan Xiaoyi's ruthless personality was destined to not surrender without a fight and die of old age in Jingdou. However, he would also not lead troops to throw themselves at the northern Qi ruler and officials watching the show in the north. That was a kind of humiliation. Yan Xiaoyi once again picked up the wine cup filled with strong wine and drained it in one gulp. Letting out a long sigh, he truly didn't know what to do. Then he received a letter. The person who wrote this letter was someone he had never thought of. Looking at this letter, his hand holding the letter began to tremble. The hand that had always been as steady as a mountain, the hand that could control the bowstring like a god, and the hand that was still like steel under the pincer attack of the Shadow and Fan Xian, 2 9th level aces, actually began to tremble. It was still the end of spring in the Qing kingdom, but far away on the border of the south, it was already blistering hot. All around, the lush forest was scorched weakly by the sun high up in the sky and laid softly on the mountain rocks. The vines on the mountain rocks had long withered from the high temperature of the rocks. The heat was not scary. What was scary was the humidity in the dense forest. For some reason there were so many torrential rains in the south. Although the rain did not last for long, when the rainwater fell to the ground, it did not even have time to sink into the earth before it was baked into steam by the high temperature. It enveloped the forest, animals and people walking on the road, making it difficult for all living things to breathe. A majestic group was lazily walking on the road. The officials of the Ministry of Rites in Honglu Temple, who were responsible for the face of the heavenly kingdom, had pulled open their robes without a care for propriety. Military discipline had always been strict. The hundreds of imperial soldiers in shining armor also had their robes and hats askew. Even the tiger guards surrounding the carriages in the middle began to have a sense of tiredness and rashness in their eyes. In the carriage in the middle sat the crown prince of the Qing kingdom. It had been more than a month since he had left the capital. The ceremony in Nanzhao had gone smoothly. After holding the coffin and crying a few times in front of the deceased king's coffin and gently chatting a bit with the child king and witnessing the ascension ceremony, the crown prince and his group set off for the north. The reason they had chosen to travel under such a large sun was because when the sun was strong, it was not easy for fog to form in the forest. In the dense forest between Nanzhao and the Qing kingdom, the most terrifying thing was the poisonous fog. Crown Prince Li Qingqian knocked on the window of the carriage, indicating for the entire group to stop. He then walked down from the carriage with the help of a eunuch and quietly said something to the main official of the Ministry of Rites. A tiger guard respectfully said, "Your Highness, take advantage of the sun to leave in order to avoid being invaded by the poisonous fog." The Crown Prince smiled slightly and said, "Let's rest. Everyone is tired." "I'm afraid we won't be able to make it to the inn in front," the tiger guard said with difficulty. "Didn't I say yesterday that there was a small inn in front of the inn?" The Crown Prince said amiably. "It would be good to stay there tonight." The official from the Ministry of Rites who had been questioned earlier tried to dissuade him. "What kind of status does your Highness have? How can you just casually stay in the wilderness? The inn in Tiancheng County is too run down. The large inn we decided on last night has already been prepared to welcome your Highness." The Crown Prince insisted on not allowing it. He only said that his attendants were already exhausted. The official from the Ministry of Rites couldn't help but ask with some fear, "But if we miss the return date, I will bear all the responsibility. We can't let these soldiers tire themselves out until they fall ill," the Crown Prince said with a frown. An order was sent down for the hundreds of people to rest on the spot. They would spend the night in Tiancheng County. They should be able to make it in time. Hearing these words, the soldiers and tiger guards immediately let out a breath and thanked the Crown Prince. They set up defenses on the two sides of the road and split up to rest. Everyone knew that the Crown Prince felt sorry for their hard work. They all gave him grateful gazes, but they didn't dare let the Crown Prince see these gazes. During this month, from Jingdo south to Nanzhao and then back north, the road was long and dangerous. However, the Crown Prince was not as delicate as people had imagined. He didn't make a sound. Furthermore, he comforted and encouraged his subordinates and was unspeakably amiable. Along the way, everyone had a new understanding of the Crown Prince. They felt that the Crown Prince truly pitied his people. Not only did he not have any resentment toward the Emperor's edict, he also never forgot about them. The Crown Prince received the edict to attend the ceremony in Nanzhao. In the eyes of the people of the world, such a difficult and unrewarding mission, even if the Emperor wasn't exiling the Crown Prince, he was still giving him a warning or a disguised punishment. But now these soldiers and officials were a bit puzzled. What could the Emperor not be satisfied with such an outstanding Crown Prince? A green curtain had been pulled up in the forest for the Crown Prince to rest. Everyone knew that it was mainly for the convenience of the Crown Prince's official duties. Although the Crown Prince had shared weal and woe with everyone along the way, they couldn't have a proper Crown Prince squat with everyone by the side of the road and defecate naked. Li Qingqian smiled helplessly at the imperial soldiers pulling the curtain. He lifted a corner of the curtain and walked in. However, he didn't undo his pants. He just waited calmly and slightly nervously. Not long after, a hand pinched a pill and sent it into the green grasshopper. It was clear that this had happened more than once. The Crown Prince directly accepted it, chewed it and swallowed it. He then used the tip of his tongue to carefully lick the gap between his teeth to make sure there wouldn't be any medicinal residue left and be discovered by the eunuchs who were supposed to serve him but were secretly monitoring him. "Why can't you give this medicine to those soldiers?" The crown prince was silent for a moment. He then spoke to the faint shadow outside the curtain. His tone was slightly sad. 7 people have already died along the way. There was too much poisonous miasma in Nanzhao. Although the Imperial Academy of Medicine had prepared excellent medicine, there were still a few Imperial soldiers and eunuchs who accidentally inhaled the miasma and died. The shadow outside the curtain paused for a moment and then said, "Your Highness, I find that I like you more and more." After saying this, 13th Wang shook his head and disappeared without a sound. The crown prince crouched down and furrowed his brows slightly. He knew that 13th Wang had been sent by Fan Xian, but he didn't know why Fan Xian was so careful to protect him. However, Fan Xian's words were clear. He didn't need to accept any favors from him. However, he didn't like the feeling of an ace following him from afar. He had once tried to have that person give all the medicine to him. However, he had eunuchs serving him every night. If someone discovered that the crown prince had medicine of unknown origin on him, it would indeed be a big problem. However, without medicine on him, he couldn't save anyone. Thinking of the people who had died along the way, the crown prince couldn't help but sigh. He had behaved very well these days to the point where he couldn't be any better. He knew what kind of person his father was. His father was looking for an excuse to depose him. If he couldn't find an excuse that wouldn't damage the emperor's reputation, his father wouldn't act in a hurry. His father cared too much about his reputation, Li Qingqian thought with a slight smile. Standing up, he threw the used paper onto the ground, thinking, what was the difference between something like face and paper used to wipe one's butt? However, he indeed needed it. At least, because of this, Li Qingqian could hold on for a while longer. A stubborn expression rose to his face. "Father, I won't give you too many excuses. If you want to depose me, then don't think you can keep your reputation." He pulled open the curtain and walked out. Looking at the piercing sunlight in the sky, he suddenly thought of the child by the coffin of the Nanzhao king. Slightly absent-minded, he thought to himself that they were both crown princes. For a father to die early was actually a fortunate thing. Chapter 515. After many months of trekking, Crown Prince Li Qingqian and his group finally returned to Jingdou from the distant Nanzhao kingdom. The road outside Jingdou was not paved with yellow earth or sprinkled with clear water. The green-black stone road smoothly stuck to the ground, welcoming the return of the heir apparent. The lush willows on either side of the road nodded slightly with the hot wind, indicating to the crown prince. Outside the city gates, welcoming the crown prince's return were the civil and military officials of the court, as well as the 3 princes who had stayed in the capital. After the greetings, the crown prince gently helped his 2 elder brothers and younger brother up. Holding hands and looking at each other, he gently spoke of the situation after they parted. The great prince looked at the crown prince with concern. After confirming that this difficult journey had not tortured his younger brother too much, he finally relaxed. Like everyone else, he was guessing why his father had given this task to the crown prince. However, his status was different from other people's. Additionally, his personality was indifferent, so he was not willing to think too deeply. In any case, what happened had nothing to do with him. It was fine as long as Qingqian was fine. The second prince, who had been silent in the manor for almost half a year, welcomed the crown prince's return with his trademark smile. However, there was something else in his smile that seeped into the crown prince's heart bit by bit. The crown prince smiled slightly at him and nodded his head. He didn't say anything. Li Qingqian held the third prince's hand and looked at the quiet and obedient face of the little boy beside him. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The situation had developed to this day, but his youngest brother had already faintly become his greatest opponent. It was truly difficult to understand. He suddenly thought of the new king of Nanzhao. He seemed to be about the same age as the third prince. His heart suddenly trembled. His hand holding the third prince's hand unconsciously loosened. However, before his index finger had completely curled up, he reacted and gently and seriously held the little hand again. The crown prince knew that his third brother was much smarter than the snot-nosed king of Nanzhao. Furthermore, his teacher was Fan Xian. However, the third prince's gaze as he looked at the crown prince appeared very calm. It far exceeded the calmness a child should have. Furthermore, there was not a trace of other emotions. A few of the dragon sons stood outside the city gates, each with their own thoughts. The crown prince lowered his head slightly and looked at the lonely shadows in the sunlight. He thought with some sadness that it seemed that father and son killing each other was unavoidable. Did brothers also have to hack at each other? The crown prince entered the palace, bowed, replied to the letter, kowtowed to the emperor, and returned to the palace. All of the procedures were as normal and smooth as the Ministry of Rites and the two temples had stipulated. There was not a single problem. At least, no one noticed that the emperor and the crown prince's expressions were the slightest bit abnormal. However, people noticed that the emperor seemed to be a bit tired and did not keep the crown prince in Taiji Palace to talk. It was completely unlike the expression a son who had not seen for nearly half a year should have when he returned home. He allowed the crown prince to return to the Eastern Palace. Led by eunuch Yao, the crown prince arrived outside the Eastern Palace. He raised his head to look at the Eastern Palace that had been repaired and couldn't help but sigh in shock. That day he had burned down this beautiful and magnificent palace. It had only been a few months, but it had been repaired to its original state. It looked like his father really didn't want to make the matter too sensational. He suddenly stilled and turned his head to ask eunuch Yao, I want to go pay my respects to the Empress Dowager later. Is that possible? Eunuch Yao paused. He was responsible for escorting the crown prince back to the Eastern Palace. Naturally, he reported to the emperor to secretly monitor him. He had to ensure that the crown prince could only return to the palace. This was a disguised form of house arrest. However, the crown prince had suddenly asked and used such a reason. Eunuch Yao could not say anything. He laughed bitterly and slowly lowered his body. In a slightly sharp voice he said, Your Highness has scared me. You are the master. You want to go see the Empress Dowager. Why are you asking me? The crown prince smiled bitterly and didn't say anything. He pushed open the main doors of the Eastern Palace. As he entered, he unconsciously glanced in the direction of Guangxin Palace. He knew that his aunt had already been imprisoned in a side courtyard of the royal palace and was being guarded by the people of the Overwatch Council. The Guangxin Palace that he was familiar with and yearned for was already empty, but he still couldn't resist greedily glancing in that direction. To the side, eunuch Yao carefully and inconspicuously watched the crown prince's expression. The crown prince acted as if he didn't exist and stared in that direction in a daze. He thought to himself, as people lived in this world there were always so many demons. He didn't know who was possessed or who was crazy. He thought of the words his aunt had said, and his heart began to thump. Yes, people were crazy. The world was crazy. Everyone in the royal family had crazy genes. If he wanted to own the world, he had to be crazy to the end. Because of his craziness and self-control, he turned around again and smiled warmly at eunuch Yao. He then closed the main doors of the Eastern Palace. Logically, the act of closing the doors should be done by serving girls and eunuchs. However, the number of eunuchs and serving girls in the Eastern Palace was far less than the number set by etiquette. A few months ago, hundreds of eunuchs and serving girls disappeared without reason. No one knew where they went. The crown prince knew they went underground. Although the Eastern Palace had been replenished with many eunuchs and serving girls, these newbies were clearly nervous. So many people had died in the royal palace. Naturally, it couldn't be hidden for long. However, no official dared to ask. For one, this was not something they should care about. For two, the officials were also afraid of death. Along the way, serving girls and eunuchs kowtowed in greeting, but no one dared to come forward to serve. The crown prince laughed self-mockingly and entered the main hall. Then he furrowed his brows and sniffed. He smelled a thick smell of alcohol. A thick, nauseating smell of alcohol floated in the most noble palace in the Qing kingdom. The light in the hall was dim. There were only a few tall lamps lit. Li Qingqian was startled and regained his sight. Only then did he see a familiar woman lying on the couch. To the side of the screen, a large leaf fan produced by the palace treasury was being waved. It fanned a light breeze and dispersed the suffocating smell in the hall. The woman wore a luxurious palace dress, but the decorations were terrible. Her hair was a bit unkempt. She held a wine jug in her hand and was currently pouring wine into her mouth. Between her brows was a haggard and hopeless expression. The person holding the large leaf fan was a young eunuch whose appearance could not be seen clearly. Li Qingqian furrowed his brows in disgust. Shortly after he sighed. A glimmer of gentleness and pity rose in his eyes as he walked forward. He knew why his mother had become like this. He also loathed how she usually pretended to be mysterious. Once the truth was revealed, she would panic beyond belief. However, she was, after all, his mother. Mother, I'm back. The half-drunk empress was startled. She rubbed her eyes and looked for a moment before she saw clearly that the young man in front of her was her son. A moment later, she suddenly burst into tears and sat up unsteadily. She threw herself in front of the crown prince and hugged him. Wailing, she said, "It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back." The crown prince hugged his mother's body and smiled warmly. I've been gone for many months. I've made you worry. A glimmer of joy flashed through the empress's eyes. She said unclearly, it's good that you're alive. I thought I would never see you again. Ever since the emperor had sent the crown prince to Nanzhao, the empress's mind had been immersed in despair. She and the emperor had been husband and wife for 20 years. Of course, she knew how heartless and terrifying the man on the dragon chair was. She had originally thought that it would be difficult for the crown prince to return after going south this time. Seeing her son alive and well, she couldn't help but be overjoyed. She found a fleeting glimmer of hope in her despair. The crown prince smiled self-mockingly. He hugged his mother and patted her back, comforting her with a few words. Up until now, the empress still did not know why the emperor had suddenly given up on the crown prince. The crown prince also did not tell her the truth. Although the people of the royal family were crazy, they did a pretty good job in the area of filial piety. Thus, the crown prince did not plan on telling his mother how many dangers and difficulties he had encountered along the way. If it wasn't for someone secretly helping him, even if he could return alive, he would probably be bedridden and unable to rise again. Before long, the half-drunk empress gradually fell asleep in the crown prince's arms. The crown prince carried her to the bed and pulled over a thin embroidered towel. He waved his hand to stop the eunuch who was pulling the large leaf fan. He took out a round fan and began to carefully fan the empress. After fanning for a long time and confirming that his mother had fallen asleep, the crown prince threw down the round fan and sat by the bed in a daze. Burying his head deeply between his knees, he did not raise it for a long time. He raised his head. His face was slightly pale. His gaze drifted to the side. Looking at the only eunuch in this empty and lonely palace, he asked, "Has the empress often drunk these days?" "Yes." The young eunuch walked out of the shadows and knelt down respectfully. Looking at the eunuch's raised face, the crown prince was shocked. He immediately furrowed his brows and said with slight mockery, "There are over 100 people in the Eastern Palace. Now only you are still alive." The eunuch was none other than the original head eunuch of the Eastern Palace, Hongzhu. A glimmer of guilt rose to Hongzhu's face. He lowered his head and didn't say anything. Up to this point, all of the servants in the Eastern Palace had been silenced by the emperor's edict. Only he was alive. This already explained all of the truth. Although Hongzhu had never told the emperor, he had told Fan Xian. All of this seemed to have started because of this, so the guilt on Hongzhu's face was not fake. During his days in the Eastern Palace, the empress and the crown prince had both treated him well, particularly the empress who had been especially warm to him. These days, he had been following the emperor's strict orders to secretly serve and monitor the empress. Seeing how the mother of the nation had gone from disappointment to despair, using alcohol day and night to numb herself, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pity in his heart. The crown prince looked at him calmly and suddenly smiled unhappily. He said to himself, "At the beginning, I thought you had offended Fan Xian, which was why father had sent you here. So, I had forgotten. In the end, you are someone from the royal study. Then, is the enmity between you and the Duke of Dambor real?" "It is real," Hongzhu lowered his head and replied. "However, I am a citizen of the Qin kingdom. Naturally, I will follow the emperor's orders." For some reason, the crown prince suddenly flew into a rage. Casually grabbing something beside him, he threw it over and cursed loudly, "You eunuch, how dare you call yourself a citizen?" The thing he threw out was the round fan he had fanned the empress with earlier. It floated lightly and didn't hit Hongzhu. Instead, it floated down beside Hongzhu and landed on the lapel of the eunuch's robes. The crown prince was afraid of waking up the empress and calmed his breathing with great difficulty. He looked at Hongzhu with a hateful gaze. "It looks like the emperor truly likes you. Knowing such a major matter, he still left you with your dog life." Hongzhu kowtowed twice and asked with some confusion, "Your Highness, what is it?" The crown prince came to his senses and was silent for a moment. He then suddenly said, "The Eastern Palace is not what it used to be. What are you still doing here? If you want to leave, I will go and tell father." Hongzhu's expression was hesitant. A moment later, he gritted his teeth and said, "I want to stay in the Eastern Palace." "Stay in the Eastern Palace to monitor?" The crown prince lowered his voice and said mockingly, "The entire palace is filled with spies. Who cares if you are one more?" Now that things had developed to this point, the crown prince knew that the emperor was going to depose him. Since that was the case, why was he still putting on an act in this secret palace? "I want to serve the empress." After the crown prince was silent for a moment, he suddenly sighed. A trace of pity rose to his face. He gazed at Hongzhu and said, Xiu also died? Kneeling on the ground, Hongzhu's body trembled. After a long time, he nodded his head sorrowfully. The crown prince gazed calmly at Hongzhu and asked a question that, logically speaking, would never have an answer. What has happened in the palace these few months? Hongzhu was silent for a long time. He then said, the emperor went to Hongguang Palace a few times. Each time he came out he was not very happy. The crown prince had a slight smile on his face. His mood relaxed slightly. He looked at Hongzhu with approval and said, thank you. Hongzhu lowered his head and said, I wouldn't dare. The crown prince sat by the side of the bed and began to think. It was clear that his father had not told the Empress Dowager the truth of this matter. For example, his face was like toilet paper and that filial piety, heaven and no one dared to stop him. Paid particular attention like his father was still troubled by a thread of ties in his heart. The emperor had put a cage around himself. Li Qingqian clenched his fists tightly. He knew he still had some time. His father was going to depose him and needed time to arrange the discussion. Even if the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council wanted to create that kind of rumor, it would not be easy. Xiu died. I wonder how Hongzhu feels, Fan Xian said quietly. If it was a normal eunuch, perhaps he wouldn't think too much about it. However, I know that Hongzhu has never been a simple eunuch. He has studied and been enlightened, so he cares about gratitude and grudges and values friendship. When all is said and done, the reason Xiu was killed is my problem and his problem. It was the two of us who single-handedly caused the deaths of hundreds of people in the royal palace. He furrowed his brows. When it comes to the emperor's ruthlessness, it seems that our imagination is still lacking. Fine, even if Hongzhu doesn't hate me, he must hate himself. Will there be any trouble like this? He once again said fine, and then said with great sadness, but those hundreds of deaths were caused by me. Yes, I am a very indifferent and emotionless person. In the end, I am not a monster like Uncle Wuzhu. I still feel strange in my heart. In the past, I told Haitang that if I killed dozens or hundreds of people, I wouldn't even blink. But I can't be the emperor because I can't keep calm when tens of thousands of people die in front of me. The emperor wanted to depose the crown prince because I secretly influenced him. Of course, even if I didn't influence it, this matter would have exploded in the end. Fan Xian shook his head. But now I want the emperor to not depose the crown prince so quickly. What? Isn't this very senseless and absurd? What exactly am I afraid of? After the oil is added to the raging fire, it will be the leftovers from the cold pot. He laughed self-mockingly. If the crown prince, second prince and eldest princess are finished, then I will be the leftovers. Even if the emperor truly loves me and is willing to take me to conquer a great world, you also know that I am a pacifist. Yes, a very hypocritical pacifist. I don't like fighting. Haven't I done so many things these 2 years to maintain my current state? Thus I have to delay a bit. At least, before I am ready, I cannot let the emperor enter the path of preparing for war. When the time comes, I will have the eldest prince lead the army and have me be the supervisor. We will kill our way into northern Qi and Dongyi. Our knives will be full of dead souls. Just thinking about these days of blood and iron makes me sad. This is the main hidden contradiction. You know that. After Fan Xian said this, he put away the piece of paper in front of him and placed it back into the box. He then began to sigh. He was angry at his own curiosity. Each time he couldn't resist taking out his mother's letter and reading it again. Each time it was very troublesome. He was in Hangzhou in Hua Garden. The large box in front of the door was still open. The snowflake silver inside flickered with a beautiful light. Like Minister Fan, he had also learned to speak to a piece of paper. However, his father was facing a portrait. He didn't have that ability, so he could only speak to the letter. There were many things that could not be said to others. The only people he could say were not by his side, so Fan Xian had a hard time holding it in. There had been a period of time in the past when he had even treated Wang Qinian as his best listener. In order to prevent the old man from being frightened into a heart attack by his words, he had finally stopped his mental torture of Wang Qinian. Uncle Wuzhu was not here. Ruoruo was not here. Wen'er was not here. Haitang was not here. Even if he had 1,000 words, to whom could he pour them out? Where could he find support for thoughts that were rebellious and could not tolerate this world? Fan Xian began to gradually feel that sense of loneliness. The meaning hidden in I am very lonely. Chapter 5:16. In reality, every person at certain times would look back at their life, trace back the past and look forward to the future. This was the so-called yesterday, today and tomorrow. However, under normal circumstances, this kind of work was often only begun after people had grown tired of life or after they had reached a certain goal. The most common model was an old man fishing beside the Wei River while sighing about how life was like the flowing water under one's feet, flowing east and never returning. Fan Xian was not Kuhi. He did not have the hobby of fishing and he was still young. However, his life had one more repetition than anyone else in this world. Calculating carefully, he should be a middle-aged man in his 30s, about to know his destiny. However, he was forced to stay in a beautiful, fragrant bag. The word forced was a bit pretentious, so let's not talk about it for now. However, he would still carry out some reflection. It was not holding a beautiful woman and lamenting that he did not work hard for the good and just cause of humanity. Rather, he was searching for clarity in a kind of chaos, trying to find his determination and clear goal again. The present him was a bit muddled. After being reborn,
it was as if
he had
the
always
entire
been a
Yamen
person with his
firm
arrival.
goal.
Had suddenly been filled with countless fine horses that had eaten bad fodder with the three representatives as the foundation.
Fan Xian unconsciously scratched
the three
his head,
great wishes had
not
basically
minding
been
that this
fulfilled.
action had lost some
However,
of his
there were
official
few
prestige.
people who were as lustful as
He
Fan
laughed
Xian.
self-mockingly.
The number of women
driving
by
away
his
all
side
the
had never
metaphysical
increased.
things that had
The
surrounded
foundation
his mind
of the
earlier.
three great wishes
Yes,
was to
life
continue
did indeed
living.
need a goal.
For the sake
but
of this
perhaps it was
goal,
too
he had
early
always
for him
worked
to start
hard,
doubting
tough,
life.
and cold-blooded.
Newton didn't become a real
Furthermore,
swindler
the hidden
until he
skill
was
or
old,
additional
while
attribute
Xiao
of the
Ai
three
spent
great
the latter
wishes
half
was
of
the
her
life
life
ideal
gnashing
he
her
had
teeth at
spoken
the
of to
unification
Minister
army.
Fan.
A
However,
powerful
these two
official.
people were, after
Presently,
all, back
in the
to
Qing
the basics.
Kingdom and under heaven,
Who was she?
Fan Xian
In the
could
end, he
truly
was
be
still
called
a
a
commoner.
powerful official.
He had to admit
Wherever
that he
he
still
went,
enjoyed
no
the
one
benefits of
disrespected
vanity,
him and no
power,
one did not
money,
fear
and
him.
fame. However,
As
it was
Fan
truly
Xian
like
greeted
this.
the officials
In the end,
amiably,
the young
he
man
walked
who knew
toward
his
his destiny
destiny still
governor's
became
manor.
muddled.
He thought
Was
to
this
himself
really
that
the
he
life
was
he
different
wanted?
from Yi Qingmei.
He was walking
It was
alone on the
best
road
not
from
to
Huan
sprinkle the
Garden to
glory
the
of
Jiangnan
idealism
governor's
on
mansion.
himself.
I seem
In
to
this
have
world,
written the
no,
wrong
in all
place
worlds,
yesterday,
idealists were lonely and
He
easy to
lowered his
die
head
a
like a
violent death.
philosopher.
Fan
But a few
Xian could
tiger
not
guards
accept
followed
either of
behind
these.
him.
It's
There
better
were
to
also
be an
many
honest
Overwatch
official,
Council
he thought
secret
to
agents
himself.
protecting him
However,
from the shadows
when he
on
walked into
both sides of the
Xueqing's
street.
study and chatted with
Sir
Xue
Fan
Qing for a
Jr.,
long time with his
the
head lowered,
Imperial
he began to
Envoy,
laugh at himself
Commissioner.
inside. A
Was
string
being
of
a
names
powerful
full of
official
passion,
something that could
flattery,
be done
and
just
slight
because one
fear
wanted
rang
to?
out from beside
That
him.
would depend on
Fan
whether or not
Xian
the
was
Emperor
startled
allowed
and
it.
raised his head
A
in
muddle-headed
astonishment.
and incompetent
He found
emperor
that he
could
had
be
already
controlled by
walked
a
into the
powerful
Jiangnan
official,
governor's
but
manor.
how could someone like
The
the
officials
Emperor
of
give him
Jiangnan
such an
were standing on
opportunity?
either side of
He had
him,
lived for over
looking at
30
him with
years.
gazes
How
full
could he
of
still be
affection
so
and
naive and
unspeakable
adorable?
passion and gentleness. He stretched lazily and narrowed his eyes at Xue Qing, who was resting with his eyes closed. He cursed silently in his heart and opened his mouth to say, "Things like checking accounts can be left to the Ministry of Revenue. The palace treasury has always been managed by the Overwatch Council. Why did the Imperial Censorate suddenly get involved? Didn't the Imperial Censors all go to prison a few months ago? Where did the Imperial Censorate find so many people to check accounts? Even if there were enough people, those people who only know how to stick to their books would probably faint when they saw the numbers on the accounts. Sir Xue, you have to submit a memorial on this matter. Jiangnan is fine, yet some people have come. It is truly unbearable." Xue Qing smiled and cursed silently in his heart. The Ministry of Revenue was opened by your old man, the Overwatch Council was managed by you, and the palace treasury was sat on by you. What was there to check? Jingdo had long had objections to this matter. Now, the Hall of Governmental Affairs had come up with a new idea. They were afraid that you would steal everything from the palace treasury and sell it. However, Fan Xian had been in Jiangnan for a year and a half and worked well with Xue Qing. The two of them had a tacit understanding. Who knew how much Xue Qing had profited from him? These words could not be said clearly. After thinking for a bit, he said, "It's not impossible to have someone come to check, but you have a long-standing grudge with the Imperial Censorate. If you have them investigate, who knows if they will use their power to avenge a personal grudge." These words could only ever be said in private by these high-ranking officials. Can they not be stopped? Do that old man Xu Wu and who the scholar have nothing better to do? In any case, there were no outsiders in the study, so Fan Xian spoke angrily. However, he knew that although it was the Hall of Governmental Affairs who had sent the letter, it was actually the Emperor's intention. Having him hold the palace treasury and Overwatch Council in one hand was, in the end, not a suitable method. He had mixed a handful of Hizongwei sand into the Overwatch Council in Jingdo and had been suppressed to the point of not daring to breathe by Ping Ping. Fan Xian was wary of whether or not the Emperor did not believe his explanation regarding Zhaoshang Money House or was wary of his relationship with the Northern Qi people. As for the matter of smuggling, he didn't care much. The eldest princess had already been gone for a decade, and he had only earned a year's worth of profit. With the flip of his hand, he had sent so much silver to the national treasury. The Emperor would not be so stingy. Seeing Fan Xian's slightly unhappy expression, Xue Qing laughed and comfortingly said, It's all for the people in court to see. What are you worried about? Even if they sent an imperial envoy to lead the 3 departments to investigate, with a flip of your hand, who would be able to find anything? Don't forget you are also an imperial envoy. Xueqing flipped his hand and took advantage of the situation to grab the cup of tea on the table and take a sip. Fan Xian stared at his steady hand and a thought flashed through his mind. Xueqing knew a little about the smuggling matter, but he didn't know the inside story, which was why he appeared so calm. If he knew that Fan Xian was secretly damaging the interests of the Qing kingdom, this old man would probably throw this cup of tea to the ground in shock. He was just about to pour some more oil and add to the fire when he unexpectedly saw Xueqing put down the teacup and change his expression to one of seriousness. When interacting in officialdom, particularly between a local emperor like Xueqing and a prince like Fan Xian, they would talk about important matters in a joking manner. This was to prevent them from feeling too estranged from each other and having an undesirable tendency towards coldness. Thus, it was the first time Fan Xian had seen Xueqing's serious expression. He couldn't help but furrow his brows. Xueqing was silent for a long time. He then slowly opened his mouth and said, "Sir Fan Jr., you know more about the Jingdo matter than I do. What is your opinion?" "Opinion? Opinion my ass. I have no opinion at all on such a major matter." Fan Xian closed his mouth and didn't make a sound. He only smiled and looked at the beard on Xueqing's chin as if he admired it. In any case in this world, other than the great grandmasters and the emperor, he wasn't afraid of anyone. Naturally, he dared to put on such a clay statue appearance. Xueqing coughed and looked at Fan Xian's appearance. He knew that his question was too unprofessional and that the other party's shamelessness was even better than his. He smiled self-mockingly. After thinking for a moment, he straightforwardly said, "Let's be frank. The emperor is going to depose the heir." Fan Xian was startled as if he hadn't heard these words clearly. A moment later he came to his senses and abruptly stood up. Staring into Xueqing's eyes, he didn't speak for a long time. He was indeed shocked in his heart. He was not shocked at the deposed heir or that Xueqing was discussing it with him. He was shocked that since Xueqing dared to say it to his face, it was certainly not something he had guessed. Rather, the emperor in the palace had already leaked the news to his loyal followers. At the same time, he was beginning to spread the news in all directions through him. Was public opinion about to begin? Xueqing's fingers gently tapped the surface of the table. Looking at him, he smiled slightly and said, "Sir Fan Jr., why are you so shocked? Isn't this within your expectations?" He suddenly sighed. A trace of pity flashed between his brows. Slowly he said, "Actually, I'm not afraid of you knowing. I've already submitted memorials to persuade the emperor to give up on this idea. However, it was to no avail." "You want me to also submit memorials?" Fan Xian looked at him. Xueqing said with slight mockery, "Everyone knows what your relationship with the crown prince is. I'm not that stupid." Pausing for a moment, he quietly said, "The emperor has already made up his mind. As officials, we can only act according to the rules." Speaking of this, Xueqing paused again. It seemed that he was also very confused. The crown prince had clearly grown up these 2 years. He was sincere and had improved in all areas. Why did the emperor suddenly want to depose the heir? However, he faintly guessed that something must have happened within the royal family. In front of Fan Xian, the illegitimate son of the royal family, he would not voice his doubts. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then asked, "How many people know of this matter?" "In Jiangnan, of course, only you and I know." The emperor was truly ruthless, Xueqing said, even to the point of being muddle-headed. "However, I believe that the governors of the 7 roads have all received the emperor's secret edict. Not only did he not make any mistakes on his trip to Nanzhou, he had also won the praise of everyone in court. Presumably, if the emperor wanted to depose the heir, it would be too difficult to find an excuse. However, although the words of the 7 roads governors had great power, they were, after all, officials. Who would lead them to do such a thing? Even if it was the emperor's secret edict, the 7 governors were not idiots. Presumably, they would not believe that they would have any good ending if they participated in the battle for the throne." Xueqing seemed to see what he was thinking and slowly said, "Presumably, I am the first official to submit a memorial to admonish the emperor for deposing the heir." Fan Xian calmly gazed into Xueqing's eyes. He knew that this person was loyal to the emperor, but he had not thought that he would be loyal to such a degree. The reason? He furrowed his brows and reminded the other party. Xueqing smiled slightly and looked at Fan Xian. "This is the reason I invited you here today. The emperor's meaning is clear. The 8th Bureau should be moving." Fan Xian had already returned to his chair. He tilted his head slightly and was lost in thought. To depose the heir, he had to use the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council to start. Back in the day, many of the Crown Prince's weaknesses had fallen into the hands of the Internal Court and Overwatch Council. Additionally, there was the Jiangnan Ming family lawsuit regarding the battle for the legitimate eldest son's right to inheritance. No matter how one looked at this matter, if the emperor wanted to depose the crown prince, he should be the lackey. His expression was calm. It was impossible to see the agitation in his heart. A moment later he said, "The places are places and Jingdo is Jingdo. If it is just these actions, the backlash from the court will be great. The scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs will not watch as the crown prince is deposed for no reason." What he said was the truth. The civil officials wholeheartedly worked for the Qing kingdom and sought stability. Regarding the emperor's seemingly absurd action, they would strongly oppose it. Who knew how many more strikes of the cane would ring out in court? In particular, the Overwatch Council cannot appear, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "It is not convenient for me to appear. The Overwatch Council is a secret agency. I have never been on good terms with the Crown Prince. If some words come out of my mouth, it will only have the opposite effect." "Your words are reasonable. I will report to the emperor," Xueqing said after thinking for a bit. Xueqing thought about it and then said, "There is something His Majesty wants me to tell you. In a few days, His Majesty will go to worship the heavens." Fan Xian was surprised again. He furrowed his brows for a long time before he slowly understood. Although the way of ghosts and gods could not prevail in the Qing kingdom and was not as deeply rooted in the hearts of the people as northern Qi's Tianyi Dao, they still had great respect for the illusory temple. If the emperor could actually create some heavenly revelation, with public opinion attacking the crown prince first, the governors of the 7 roads sending in memorials, and then finding some officials to accuse the crown prince of being immoral and unfit to inherit the country, in the end, the emperor was put in a difficult position. He personally went to worship heaven in the temple and accepted heaven's order to depose the heir. What an absurd play, what a senseless trick. Fan Xian shook his head and asked, "When?" Chapter 517. There is a typo, a big typo bothering me. A few days ago, a friend reminded me in the book review section. I thank you very much. However, I didn't add to it at the time. Now I've forgotten your ID. I'm truly sorry. Most importantly, there was a power outage yesterday. Although I had the book, I lost the internet. I was in a rush to go to a classmate's house to update and wrote the chapter names wrong. What bitter tears. It should have been a ridiculous thing. I'm truly sorry. Today I was looking at the monthly vote rankings. Qingyu is 4th in the old book. Oh no. Amidst the screams, fifth, 200 fewer votes than the top three. Shake as hard as you can to get the votes out of your jars. The Crown Prince and Fan Xian were brothers by blood. There was no irreconcilable hatred between the two to atone for his crimes. In the end, that was a matter for the elders. Even at this time, no official had once expressed his desire to reconcile with Fan Xian, but Fan Xian did not believe him. When the Supreme Court and the Overwatch Council took Exan Chiwu into prison, they all thought that this matter was over to bring him down. Who would have thought that the biggest target of Fan Xian's actions during this half a year was the eldest princess? Exan Chiwu was a confidant of the Eastern Palace, the Emperor would only imprison her in the end and rush to depose because of his good relationship with Fan Xian. This reality made Fan Xian tortured in the Overwatch Council. He always felt that there was a problem with the order. Even so, given the Emperor's many years of immersion in the arena, he shouldn't have made such a mistake. Secret memorial regardless of whether or not there was a mistake in the royal study. The matter of deposing the heir had, in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the ministers of the six ministries, using the word other figures not the center of Qing Kingdom's power. The wind rises at the end of a duckweed. And who the scholar any major event in history at the beginning and even acted as a guarantor. Just some unremarkable only then did the Emperor dispel his feigned anger. A few months ago, the Eastern Palace had caught fire, and the Crown Prince had gone together to drink again. When the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council threw out some old stories, the Emperor was truly determined to depose the heir. Interested and reinvestigated the matter of the winter coats of the Northern Army. They had to protect the Ministry of Revenue began to cooperate in researching where the silver had gone. It was just an attitude they had to express as pure officials. In the spring of last year, the Crown Prince was the heir, they had to treat him like half an emperor. The second Prince's factions had investigated the Ministry of Revenue. Most importantly, the officials in court they found represented by whom of the winter jackets of the Northern Expedition Army may have been preposterous and muddle-headed in the Crown Prince had not, but he had improved a great deal these 2 years. In order to prevent the court from being shaken by the fight for royal power, the Crown Prince avoided the fate of losing face far away in Jiangnan. But now that the court had participating in these matters again, they truly hoped that the Emperor would be able to calm his heart and set the Qing Kingdom's no longer had many loyal figures. No matter how one looked at it, the present Crown Prince was the best choice for Qing Kingdom. It not only prevented internal friction in Qing Kingdom, but it also prevented the Overwatch Council, the young man's domination. The Qing Emperor was not an incapable ruler. He knew the benefits the checks and balances between ruler and officials brought to Qing Kingdom. He also expected that the matter of deposing the heir would certainly cause a great wave of opposition. Thus, he temporarily chose to be silent. It seemed that after the first wave, his thoughts of deposing the heir had been dispelled. However, Hu the scholar and all of the officials knew that their emperor was not someone who made decisions easily. Once he made a choice, no matter what difficulties he faced, he would persevere to the end. As expected, a few days later, the governor of Jiangnan Road, Sir Xueqing's memorial was delivered to the palace. It was read in court. Every word and sentence was directed at the Eastern Palace. Everyone knew the hidden meaning. Xu Wu flew into a rage. Although he knew that this situation could not be reversed, he still stepped out of line and loudly cursed Xueqing for having a disloyal heart and spouting nonsense. The emperor pitied Xu Wu's old and weak body and ordered him to return to his manor to rest for 3 months. He did not punish him at all. The other 6 governors' memorials arrived. Their tones were either heavy or light, overt or covert, but they all subtly expressed their attitudes. The situation was gradually becoming clear. The emperor wanted to depose the heir. The governors of the 7 roads were forced by the emperor's might to submit memorials in response. Only the officials in court were caught in the middle. Even if they wanted to object, they felt the sky above them was covering them and the thorns below them were rising. They felt uncomfortable all over. Although Xu Wu had been invited back to his manor, the Hall of Governmental Affairs continued to perform the righteous role that the Qing Emperor allowed them to perform. The courageous officials in court chose their words carefully and expressed their opposition. The timid maintained their silence. Not a single official, under the Emperor's hint, courageously submitted a memorial asking the Emperor to change the heir. Even the most flattering people would find it difficult to do such a thing. All the civil and military officials in court and the people of Jingdo were watching these officials. The Crown Prince had not made any major mistakes, yet he was going to be deposed. It was truly inexcusable and would be impossible to explain in the history books in the future. After the court conference adjourned, a few representatives of the civil officials came to the Shu Manor and carefully asked for Xu the scholar's opinion. In any case, the emperor knew about these things, so they were not afraid of someone reporting that they had formed a clique. Xu Wu was wearing a cloth robe. After a long silence, he smiled and said, "All things in the world have to pay attention to a reason, particularly the matter of the heir to the throne. It involves the will of heaven and the people. If it does not make sense, then it cannot be served." Fan Xian once said, "The worries of the world come first and the joys of the world come later." This is a national matter, not a family matter of the emperor. As an official, I have to help the emperor solve his worries and remove the worries of the Qing kingdom. There is no need to try to figure out the emperor's heart. Just ask your own. The emperor has already made up his mind. What can be done? Shu Wu stroked the beard on his chin and laughed as he usually did. The sir he spoke
once
of
said
was
that
the
an
master
official
of the
cannot
manor,
accept the
Zhuang
emperor's
Mohan,
messy
who had
orders.
passed away 2 years ago. The civil officials split up and went home, each of them silent. In reality, if the emperor wanted to hint to the officials to send in memorials, there were many other ways to easily find the spokespersons in court. Strangely, ever since the storm began, other than the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, the emperor had never summoned any official into the palace alone. Thus, the officials were also confused as to whether or not the emperor's mind had not been made up. They were not the governor of the 7 roads, the emperor's servants, so they did not dare to randomly send in memorials. The court sank into an awkward silent confrontation. In the Eastern Palace, the crown prince, who was at the center of the matter, remained warm and quiet. It was as if he did not take this matter to heart. There were no capable people in his faction, yet he had won the support of so many civil officials. This could be said to be an unexpected joy, but it was also an unexpected shock. Thus, while the crown prince was secretly grateful, he grew increasingly silent. In this storm of deposing the heir, there were 2 young people who stood out of the matter and attracted the eyes of the officials the most. The appearances and temperaments of these 2 young nobles were similar. Furthermore, their relationships with the crown prince were complicated. Yet, up until now, their behavior had been unexpected. The first was Fan Xian. In people's eyes, he was a true member of the 3rd prince's faction. Furthermore, he was the emperor's illegitimate child. His identity was too sensitive. Before and after the governor of the 7 roads sent in memorials, he maintained a deathly silence in Jiangnan. His daily invitations to the palace did not mention this matter at all. He only talked in circles about the palace treasury and the daily affairs around it. Although the Overwatch Council had investigated the Eastern Palace from the Ministry of Revenue, it was clear that their investigation was not as strong as the officials had imagined. Everyone could see clearly that the Overwatch Council's actions in Jingdo had nothing to do with Fan Xian. Thus, people suddenly thought of something. Did the emperor throw Fan Xian to Jiangnan also have the intention of cutting him off from the Overwatch Council? Why did Commissioner Fan, who was always gentle on the outside and determined on the inside, not take this opportunity to beat him when he was down? The second was the 2nd prince. Before Fan Xian entered the capital, the 2nd prince had always been deeply favored by the emperor. He was the first of the emperor's sons to be made a king and had a large group of civil officials at his side in court. Later, everyone learned that the eldest princess was protecting the crown prince in the open but was secretly protecting him. This 2nd prince was not simple. He faintly stood up to the crown prince as an equal. The so-called fight for the heir was actually directed at him first. The major events in Jingdo during this half a year seemed to have nothing to do with the 2nd prince. After the eldest princess was placed under house arrest, nothing happened to the 2nd prince. Instead, it was the crown prince who had been exiled by the emperor. Now that the crown prince had been deposed, logically speaking, the 2nd prince should be the one to benefit the most. It was reasonable for him to take action. Even if he wanted to avoid suspicion and gain the emperor's favor by adhering to filial piety and remaining silent, he had actually personally written to defend the crown prince in the Northern Expedition Army winter jacket case and secretly mobilized officials in his faction to stand against the emperor's intentions. Of course, his power in court had basically been shattered by Fan Xian's 2 campaigns. After operating for so many years, he still had some mouths to speak. Most importantly, after he married Yi Lingyao, it was as if he had become half a master of the Yi family. His words on behalf of the crown prince were indeed useful. The crown prince's 2 brothers, 2 of his greatest enemies, used different methods to express their support during the crown prince's most dangerous time. This was truly a wondrous, wonderful, and mysterious situation. Presumably, the Qing emperor's emotions at this time were very complicated. Before the matter of deposing the heir had reached its climax, a climax had already occurred on one of the 3 most dangerous borders in the world. It shocked the already anxious Qing officials into excitement. The 3 most dangerous borders were the border between northern Qi and the northern Man, the border between the Qing kingdom and Shihu, and the border between the Qing kingdom and northern Qi. In the extreme north, there had been 3 consecutive years of snowstorms. The frozen northern Man cattle and horses died. They had no choice but to move around the sky. After tens of thousands of li of bitter battle, they finally circled around from the north of northern Qi to the west of the Qing kingdom. However, they paid the tragic price of 70 to 80% of their entire population. This was a major event in history. For the present world, it had a far-reaching effect. First of all, the northern Qi people no longer had to worry about the tall and barbaric barbarians behind them. They could finally free up a hand to deal with the Qing people in the south. That hand was the famous general Shang Shanhu. After Shi Hu used 2 years to digest the northern man who came to join them, their strength suddenly increased. Although there were not many northern man survivors, those who could endure tens of thousands of li of travel without food or medicine were all elite young men and women picked out from thousands of li. The Qing kingdom was attacked from both front and back. The pressure increased dramatically. Only then did the Dingzhou Yi family send emergency reinforcements to the western front. King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing, was playing hide-and-seek with the Hu people in the west. In the north, Yan Xiaoyi had also returned to camp early. He used his powerful military power to suppress Shang Shanhu's strategy and the northern Qi people's bad ideas. The climax of the border this time erupted on the northern front, between the northern governor Yan Xiaoyi and the famous general Shang Shanhu. When Shang Shanhu led the army back and gave Yan Xiaoyi time to think and prepare, Yan Xiaoyi did not even think about his path of retreat in the Qing kingdom or prepare to receive the Qing emperor's arrest. He directly led the army north. With 20,000 elite soldiers, he followed Sangzhou and Yanjing and attacked the northern camp. There was never too much deception in war. The power of the army was like a hurricane. Yan Xiaoyi carried out this principle perfectly. Without asking the Bureau of Military Affairs or waiting for the Qing emperor's edict, he personally led the army and attacked. Shang Shanhu, who had always calculated everything on the battlefield, clearly did not expect that Yan Xiaoyi would still have the mind to send out troops to attack when he could not even protect himself. The northern Qi army was slowly retreating 50 li. Before they could set up camp, they were suddenly attacked in the night and suffered heavy losses. The Qing kingdom army had only paid with 5,000 lives. It was a great victory in Sangzhou. In people's impression, this seemed to be the first time Shang Shanhu had lost a battle. When the news got back to Jingdou, regardless of whether it was Shu the scholar who had been ordered to rest, or the common people selling alcohol on the streets, they all became excited. The desire to fight and the passion to expand the borders buried deep in the Qing people's blood was stirred to its peak by this shameless, great victory. The black cloud that had been floating above Jingdou did not seem so piercing. Everyone thought that with such great news, the emperor would not continue to persist in his absurdity and do things contrary to people's emotions. It was truly not a good choice. Following the arrival of the battle report was the northern Qi emperor's letter. In the letter, the northern Qi emperor cursed angrily, saying that the two countries were on good terms, yet they were so shameless. After receiving the letter, the Qing emperor only smiled and handed the matter to the office of the Grand Herald and the Board of Rights to handle. In today's world, the boundaries between countries were always so vague. It was always hard to say who entered whose territory. If it was really a misunderstanding, he could apologize in a few days. In any case, the person who was killed could not come back to life. The emperor smiled slightly at eunuch Hong beside him and said, "Yan Xiaoyi is not bad. He knows to use the correct method to explain to me the meaning of his existence. Yes, people who had no meaning of existence should not continue to exist. For example, the Crown Prince." Thus, the Supreme Court continued to interrogate the Winter Jacket case. The Overwatch Council continued to dig up all of the Crown Prince's wrongdoings. The most shameless was the Eighth Bureau. It seemed that they were preparing to write a memoir of the Crown Prince's teasing of serving girls as a child. The matter of deposing the heir did not stop because of Yan Xiaoyi's great victory. It only rested for a while. Under the disappointed gazes of the officials, it slowly and unquestionably proceeded. None of this had anything to do with Fan Xian. He was on a civilian boat looking at the council report in his hand in a daze. He thought to himself that the emperor was indeed more shameless than him. It looked like in a few days the worship Shui Qing had once mentioned would begin. He wondered what the quiet Qing temple in Jingdou would be like at that time. To find a reason to depose the crown prince and then worship heaven for an edict. The emperor was the son of heaven. Naturally, the crown prince was heaven's grandson. If heaven thought this grandson was not obedient, then heaven's son could only do as he was told. If this was written, it would be much more beautiful in the history books. It was truly shameless to the extreme. Fan Xian shook his head and put down the council report. Ever since Shui Qing began to write, he had fled Suzhou. He had not returned to Hangzhou or Wuzhou. He had only disguised himself as a commoner and boarded a civilian boat. Unconsciously, he wanted to get as far away from this political whirlpool as possible. He also knew about the second prince writing to protect the crown prince. He thought to himself that the second prince's heart was truly ruthless. Chapter 5:18. There are still 80 votes from the top 3. Everyone good luck. I also do my best. It seems to be reaching the climax. I'm a bit panicked. Fan Xian was not running. He was running away. In any case, he was walking away from Jiangnan, Jingdou, and the heart of the political storm in the Qing kingdom. He knew that no matter how the situation in Jingdou developed, the emperor had already made up his mind. No one could stop the matter of deposing the heir. Since it was so, any further action he took would be superfluous. Furthermore, he was worried that when the emperor prayed to heaven, he would drag him back to Jingdou and place him in front of him as a human shield. The crown prince had been deposed. There would certainly be a lot of turbulence in the court. No matter how Fan Xian calculated, the emperor would certainly have him carry out a clash with those turbulence and restabilize the balance of the court. During this period of time, his mood had always been low. Just as mentioned earlier, questions concerning life always floated back and forth in his mind. He did not have the energy to pay attention to these things. He knew that at a time like this, the further he ran, the smarter he was. Furthermore, each time he thought of the Qing emperor making such a decision in that beautiful and lonely Qing temple, Fan Xian felt strange and uncomfortable in his heart. That temple was where he and Lin Wanner had first met. It was where he and his wife had pledged their love. Now it had become a place to fight for power. It was very annoying. Thus he chose to stay far away. When Yin Xiaoyi led tens of thousands of elite soldiers straight toward the north camp to carry out a night attack, Fan Xian also boarded a large ship on a slightly stuffy night and headed straight from Hangzhou to the sea. He planned to circle around the rising and falling coastline of the Qing kingdom's east and carry out a peaceful journey. This time he left before the emperor's edict arrived. He also didn't inform Xueqing and carried it out in secret. Fan Xian did not want to participate in this matter again, so he ran with great determination. If the Qing emperor found out that the edict he had summoned for him could not be delivered, he might be angry, but he could not blame him. He was the imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road and needed to sit in the yamen. The only place he needed to sit in the yamen was in the palace treasury. His trip in disguise this time was in the name of inspecting the palace treasury's eastern road. However, his destination was Danzhou. He had 2 goals in returning to Danzhou. One was to see his grandmother. The housekeeper in the Danzhou manor had sent a letter saying that his grandmother's health had not been well recently. This made him very worried. Secondly, he wanted to ask for her opinion on the complicated situation in the Qing kingdom and the world. Ever since he was a child, he had grown up beside his grandmother in Danzhou and received her teachings. Whenever the tense became chaotic and uncontrollable, he would always unconsciously ask for her guidance. Perhaps his grandmother could not help him much, but at least she could calm his heart. The ship left the harbor and advanced with all its might towards the rising sun in the east. Fan Xian only had time to admire the majestic scenery before returning to the cabin. He sat next to the large chest of silver, tilted his head, and began to count. He was counting the Zhangzhou victory report in the council report. No matter how Fan Xian counted, he did not feel that there was anything wrong with the victory. It was just that the timing of the battle or local battles was a bit strange. He furrowed his brows. These days he had already begun to make arrangements. Once the situation in the Qing kingdom was settled, how he should handle it, whether or not he should give up the Overwatch Council, and how the emperor would arrange for him. But as he thought about it carefully, he always felt that he was thinking too early. When the cunning rabbit died, even if the dog didn't enter the pot, there wouldn't be much meat to eat. The problem now was that not only was the cunning rabbit not dead, it had also been overly well behaved. Accurately speaking, as long as the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, did not die, Fan Xian did not think this matter would come to a complete end. After a few more days, the matter of deposing the heir in Jingdou should have reached its final stages. Fan Xian was alone on the ocean and did not know the progress of the matter. Because he didn't want to accept an imperial edict, he even had the ship temporarily cut off contact with the Overwatch Council's intelligence system. Like a black anti-radar aircraft, he floated alone on the ocean. The ship arrived in a small city on Jiangbei Road. The civilian ship he was on was modified from the Overwatch Council's military ship. Normal people would not be able to see anything wrong with it. He had thought that on the way back to Danzhou he would not attract any attention. Unexpectedly, the officials in that small town respectfully delivered generous gifts, and without requesting to meet them, they withdrew on their own accord. Fan Xian was a bit confused. He wondered how this minor official had guessed he was on the ship. Wang Qinian smiled and said, "You are too imposing." This flattery was too poor, so Fan Xian expressed his dissatisfaction. He turned his gaze to the other man with the surname Wang. 13th Wang glanced at him and shrugged. "Who knows? It seems to me that you're quite happy to receive the gifts." Fan Xian was not happy that he had seen through his vain side. 13th Wang laughed heartily and walked to the side of the ship. Holding the green banner in his hand, it was like a small sail. The most important thing in officialdom was to exchange information. The officials in the small city knew that the commissioner of the Overwatch Council was on the ship. Thus, all the officials in the provinces along the coast knew of this news. From that day on, the ship followed the coastline north. Every time it stopped, local officials would come forward to give gifts. They all seemed to guess that Fan Xian did not want to see them, so they did not ask to meet. After traveling and stopping for a dozen days, 14 groups of people came on the ship to give gifts and greetings. Fan Xian sat at the head of the ship and looked at the large piece of green jade that brushed past him. It was the Dong Mountain that had been cut in half by the heavenly sword. He was still lost in thought. How had his movements been completely discovered by others? In any case, he was getting further and further away from Jingdo and the Emperor. Fan Xian's mood became more and more relaxed. On the contrary, he was slightly intoxicated by the scenery along the way and the scene of the officials waiting on him like grandsons. In another world within another world, there was once a drunkard named Linghu who had taken a boat on the Yellow River. He had muddle-headedly received countless large gifts, received countless verbal benefits and suffered physical pain. Presumably that eldest disciple's vanity had been greatly satisfied, especially in front of those shameless junior brothers and junior sisters. Fan Xian had taken a boat on the East Sea and also muddle-headedly received countless large gifts. Although no one dared to disturb him, his vanity had been satisfied to a certain extent. Particularly when Jingdo was in the midst of a storm, he was able to float on a boat on the sea. The wind of the great path was swift. This kind of feeling was very pleasing. Even if this kind of pleasure was only temporary. After the boat passed the isolated seaside and the great Dong Mountain that pierced the sky like a half-jade sword, it made 2 more turns. When the temple at the top of the mountain could no longer be seen, it was nearing Danzhou harbor. This was the second time Fan Xian had taken this sea route. He did not have the same impact as the first time he had on the strange and majestic Great Dong Mountain. However, he still felt his heart tremble slightly. The large boat anchored in Danzhou harbor. No officials came to welcome them. Fan Xian let out a breath. Taking Gao Da and a few other tiger guards and 6 bureau swordsmen, he arrived at the door of the old Danzhou manor amidst the burning gazes and endless greetings of the Danzhou people. Fan Xian smiled slightly and thought, hadn't he just come back a year ago? Why were these people still so warm and excited? He stretched out his hand and knocked on the familiar wooden door of the old manor. Just as his finger landed on the door, he furrowed his brows. He could clearly feel countless wary gazes focused on him from all around the manor. However, the owners of these gazes clearly knew how to hide their bodies. For a short time he did not discover exactly where they were. The countless auras, bright and dark, were filled with a suffocating pressure. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and bent his knees slightly. His left hand gripped the trigger of the crossbow in his sleeve. His right hand hung naturally, ready at any moment to grab the slender black dagger in his boot. At his side, Wang Qinian's expression did not change. He held the Wei Emperor's sword horizontally. The body of the sword was half exposed and glimmered with a cold light. The hilt was where Fan Xian could most easily reach out and pull it out. 13th Wang's gaze was lowered as he held the green banner tightly. The tiger guards, led by Gao Da, also sensed the abnormality. Their brows furrowed slightly as their hands gripped the hilts of their long knives. Only the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council reacted slightly slower. They had been scattered around the commissioner the entire time. Suddenly encountering an enemy, they naturally moved their bodies closer to the shops on the side of the street. Using the darkness of the buildings, they were ready at any moment to dive into the darkness and carry out the most direct conflict with the hidden enemies. Fan Xian was a person who was very afraid of death. Although he did not bring many people, they were all the most powerful in the world. In the past he had the Shadow and Haitang as the vanguard. Now he had 13th Wang as the fierce warrior. Added to himself, the tiger guards and the swordsmen, with such a powerful defensive power, even if a great grandmaster came, Fan Xian was confident that he could hold out for a few rounds. In other words, he had always been ready to receive the assassination of a great grandmaster. However, outside the old Danzhou manor, Fan Xian felt a sense of pressure from the people hidden around him despite the powerful power around him. Furthermore, this pressure came from one person. This proved that the person who came was not a great grandmaster. Who else in this world could gather so many aces? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and suddenly smiled bitterly. The wooden door of the old Danzhou manor was slowly pulled open. Following a creak, the tense atmosphere immediately disappeared. A familiar face appeared behind the door, but this face should not have appeared in Danzhou. Sir Ren. Fan Xian looked at Taichung Temple official Ren Xiao, and inside the manor and smiled bitterly. Why are you waiting for me in my home? Ren Xiao, and smiled but did not greet him. Instead he made a gesture of invitation. Fan Xian paused slightly and turned his head to glance at 13th Wang. 13th Wang smiled and stayed outside the manor with the swordsman of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian led Wang Qinian, Gao De, and the others toward the old manor. Along the way they did not find anything strange. However, they could feel that this usually quiet and secluded courtyard was now filled with a sense of tension. No one knew how many aces were hidden behind the trees and behind the walls. Walking to the door of the back courtyard, Ren Xiao, and stopped his steps. A eunuch welcomed Fan Xian in with a face full of smiles. The smile on Fan Xian's face grew more bitter. He looked at eunuch Yao speechlessly for a long time. Walking to the little building in the back courtyard, a few officials were waiting quietly on the first floor. Seeing Fan Xian enter, they all rose and bowed. Fan Xian returned each of their greetings. He recognized the Minister of the Board of Rites and the Imperial Astronomer. Eunuch Yao walked him to the first floor. Fan Xian picked up the front of his robe and walked with heavy steps toward the second floor. His grandmother lived on the second floor. Lifting the beaded curtain outside the second floor, Fan Xian walked steadily in. Looking at his sickly grandmother on the couch, a glimmer of heartache flashed across his face. Looking at the middle-aged man holding his grandmother's hand and talking by the couch, a glimmer of fear flashed through his heart. He walked to the front of the couch and knelt down obediently. Kowtowing to the two of them, he then forced a smile and said, "Your Majesty, why are you here?" Fan Xian's heart was filled with shock and helplessness. This time he had left Hangzhou for Danzhou and taken in the sights along the way. He had thought he would be as free and at ease as his eldest disciple brother, waving his sleeves and throwing the matter of dethroning the heir to the back of his mind. He had not thought that his teacher Yu Buchuan would be waiting for him here. Am I not allowed to come? The emperor looked at Fan Xian with a difficult-to-understand smile on his face. Slowly he said, "You are an imperial envoy, yet you have come to Danzhou on business. I remember that I only gave you authority over Jiangnan Road. I didn't tell you to manage the matters of Dongshan Road." Fan Xian said with a pained expression, "It was mainly to check on the palace treasury's east road. After passing Jiangbei Road, I thought it was not far from Danzhou, so I came to see grandmother. I heard that she was not well. As her grandson." Before he finished speaking, the emperor cut him off angrily. "Filial piety is not something that can be used as an excuse. Run, I want to see where else you can run to." Fan Xian was dumbfounded. He thought, "You want to dethrone the crown prince. I just don't want to participate. There is no need for you to be so angry, right?" However, he had boundless confusion and worry in his heart. He was not stupid enough to argue with the emperor. He smiled and said, "I am an ant in your Majesty's hand. No matter how I run, I cannot escape the palm of your hand." This flattery clearly did not change the emperor's mood. However, the emperor did not seem to want to pursue this matter. Lightly he said, "Since you have come to show filial piety, then quickly come up and have a look. If you can't cure it, I will carefully skin you." After saying this, the emperor stood and quietly said by the old woman's ear, "Mother, rest well. I will come see you again tonight." Then he walked out of the room on the second floor, leaving behind a confused Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed his legs and stood up. He sat down by his grandmother's side and placed his finger on her pulse. A moment later, his body softened and a streak of cold sweat appeared on his back. The old woman smiled slightly and said, "You monkey, aren't you afraid of scaring me like this? My body is fine. You should be afraid of something else." Fan Xian felt guilty and speechless. He was indeed afraid of something else. The emperor had come to Danzhou without anyone knowing. Wasn't Jingdou an empty palace? At the crucial moment of dethroning the crown prince, why did the emperor dare to leave Jingdou? Chapter 519. I'm in the top 3. Thank you everyone. Come on, give me some more monthly votes. Thank you, thank you. Fan Xian sat on the bed and gently held his grandmother's hand. He found that the wrinkles on her hand had deepened. There was a palpitating feeling of being separated from flesh and blood. After taking her pulse, he found that his grandmother had only occasionally caught a cold. Her body was fine. However, she was getting on in years. Her oil was about to run out and her lamp was about to run out. He didn't know how many more years she could endure. Thinking of this, his mood dropped. Adding to the shock brought by the emperor downstairs, it made him sink into silence. After the second floor was silent for a long time, the old woman sighed and said, "Just what are you worried about?" "I don't know how I'm going to walk my path in the future." Fan Xian looked at his grandmother's serious face and smiled slightly. He knew that under his grandmother's serious face hid a gentle heart. "You've walked well these few years." The old woman's voice was lowered slightly. Although the people downstairs certainly couldn't hear their conversation, she smiled amiably and rubbed Fan Xian's head. She smiled kindly and rubbed Fan Xian's head. Her tone and expression both revealed a sense of pride and relief. Given the position and reputation Fan Xian had obtained these 3 years, the old woman, who had single-handedly taught this grandson, had enough reason to be proud. Half of a 100-li journey is 90 li. Fan Xian patted his head self-mockingly. "I'm just afraid my head will suddenly fall off halfway." The old woman looked calmly at her grandson. A moment later, she gently said, "Did the emperor's arrival in Danzhou make you have some inauspicious thoughts?" Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a long time. He confirmed what the emotions that had spontaneously risen in him earlier were. He then nodded his head solemnly. The old woman looked into his eyes and quietly said, "You've grown up, but there are some things I must remind you of." "Please speak, grandmother." "The Fan family has never needed to pick a side, and you even less need to pick a side because we have always stood in front of the emperor," the old woman said solemnly and seriously. The old lady said seriously, "As long as you can guarantee this, then you will never make a mistake." There were countless meanings hidden in these words, but they were all built on the strongest foundation of trust in the emperor. Fan Xian glanced at his grandmother with some confusion but didn't dare to ask. There's no need to doubt what has been proven in the past 30 years. Fan Xian did not think this way. He believed that what history had proven would often be overturned by the future. He thought for a bit and then said, "But under these circumstances, it is truly too risky for the emperor to leave Jingdou. Are you going to remonstrate later?" The old mistress looked at her grandson with a faint smile. Fan Xian thought for a moment, then nodded. "We should still be able to make it if we rush back now." In reality, these words were just empty words. He knew that since the emperor had come to Danzhou at this time, he must have very important thoughts in his heart. It was not something he could chase away with just a few words. However, as an official, particularly one who had to pretend to be a loyal and filial son, there were some things he had to say in person. The Madame Dowager smiled and said, "Then you should go. Otherwise, His Majesty will be impatient." Fan Xian also smiled but didn't leave immediately. He carefully used the Jinqi of Tianyi Dao to probe into his grandmother's body to check the condition of her body. He left behind a few prescriptions and chatted with her for a while until she began to feel sleepy. Only then did he help her pull up the thin towel and tiptoed down the stairs. Coming down to the first floor, the Minister of the Board of Rites, the Imperial Astronomer, and Eunuch Yao all looked at Fan Xian with strange gazes. These people had not thought that Sir Fan Jr. would be so daring as to stay on the second floor for so long and leave the Emperor, who had been waiting to speak with him, hanging for half a day. In this world, Fan Xian was probably the only person who dared to make the Qing Emperor wait for so long. These bigwigs were all thinking that His Majesty's love for this illegitimate child had indeed reached a very exaggerated level. Fan Xian bowed to these people and asked with a slight smile, "Where is the Emperor?" The Minister of the Board of Rites forced a smile and glanced outside, pointing the way for him. Eunuch Yao suppressed a smile and led Fan Xian out the door. Looking at the osmanthus flowers in the garden. Danzhou was most famous for its scented tea. Minister Fan and Fan Xian both liked it. Every year the old manor would send it to Jingdou. A portion of it was even offered as a tribute to the palace. Although the garden in the old manor was not large, Fan Xian had partitioned off a corner and planted some osmanthus flowers to mix with tea. Walking to the corner of the garden, Eunuch Yao retreated with his body hunched. Fan Xian felt it was strange. The head eunuch of the royal study was not at the emperor's side to serve. Why had he run off? As he thought this, he had already stepped into the garden and saw the emperor under the tree. There was also the old man by the emperor's side. Fan Xian secretly sucked in a breath of cold air. No wonder Eunuch Yao didn't have to be by the emperor's side. There was another eunuch at his side. He walked forward and bowed to the emperor. At the same time, he turned his body and said to the eunuch as politely and not abruptly as possible, "Greetings, eunuch Hong." Expressing goodwill to a eunuch in front of the emperor was something that should not have happened, but Fan Xian knew that eunuch Hong was not a normal person. However, Fan Xian knew that eunuch Hong was no ordinary person. Even the emperor would give him some respect. Greeting him should not mean much. Hong Xiang smiled slightly and glanced at Fan Xian. He didn't say anything and retreated behind the emperor. The emperor moved his gaze from the osmanthus tree in the garden and clapped his hands. Turning his head, he said to Fan Xian, "I heard you moved these trees in and planted them?" Fan Xian replied, "Yes, the old manor's garden is not large. Previously there weren't many trees planted inside. It looked rather boring, particularly in the spring and summer. There are tall trees and bushes of flowers outside, but it is too quiet inside, so I moved a few." "Looks like you have some interest, child," the emperor smiled. The emperor smiled and said, "Back then when I lived in this courtyard there were also trees. However, they were all broken by my people who practiced martial arts." Fan Xian was speechless. He had lived in this manor for 16 years, but he had never known that the emperor had once lived here. The old woman's mouth was truly tight shut. He suddenly thought of the past that his father and King Jing had once mentioned. Back then, the emperor had once taken Qin Pingping and his father to Danzhou to play. At that time, the emperor was still an unknown heir. It was in Danzhou that they had met his mother and uncle Wuzhu. Looking at it this way, when the emperor lived in the old manor, it was also the moment the wheel of history began to turn. As he strolled around the garden and chatted idly with the emperor, Fan Xian's mood gradually became anxious. He didn't know what opportunity he should find to open his mouth and urge the emperor to hurry back to the capital. The expression on his face began to appear unnatural. "I am not in plain clothes." Seeming to guess what Fan Xian was thinking, the emperor said with slight mockery, "3 days after I left Jingdo, I announced it to the world, so don't worry too much." Fan Xian opened his eyes wide and asked in shock, "Your Majesty, everyone knows you have come to Danzhou?" "Wrong, everyone knows I am going to worship heaven." The emperor glanced at him, put his hands behind his back, and walked first out of the garden. Fan Xian glanced at eunuch Hong with some confusion and quickly followed. Following behind the emperor, he asked, "Your Majesty, why did I not know of this matter?" The emperor did not stop walking. Smiling coldly, he said, "Imperial envoy, you were having fun on the sea. How could you have received the edict I sent to Hangzhou?" Fan Xian was greatly embarrassed and didn't reply. The emperor paused and then angrily said, "You are, after all, an imperial envoy. How could you leave your post without permission?" "I have already given the edict for you to meet up with the group worshipping heaven. When you return to Hangzhou in the future, walk through these procedures." After Fan Xian's great embarrassment, he was slightly surprised. The emperor's edict had long been announced to the world for him, an imperial envoy, to join the group worshipping heaven. No wonder the officials along the coast had guessed the people on the ship. However, the emperor's words earlier were clearly to protect him. It looked like after the Jingdo matter had passed a few months ago, the emperor's mood did not seem so bad. Seeing the emperor's footsteps step out of the old manor's wooden door, the guards hidden in the shadows and officials in the courtyard all followed out. For a moment, the scene was incomparably lively. Fan Xian couldn't resist anymore and caught up a few steps. Lowering his voice, he said, "Your Majesty, the situation in Jingdo is not yet settled. Since it is time to worship heaven, I will escort your Majesty back to the capital." The emperor stopped his steps and turned his head to glance at him with amusement. "Since it is to worship heaven, why do we have to return to the capital?" Fan Xian replied, "Naturally, it is in the Qing temple." "There is more than one Qing temple," the emperor said lightly. "There is also a temple on Dong Mountain." Fan Xian's heart jumped. For a moment he couldn't speak. The emperor had traveled thousands of li to Dong Mountain to worship heaven. No wonder there were very few scholars and officials among the servants with him. Instead, it was the minister of the Board of Rites, Taichung Temple, and the imperial astronomer who followed. Worshipping heaven and deposing the heir indeed needed these people. Why wasn't this done in Jingdo? Why had it come to the shores of the East Sea? Was the emperor not worried at all? "I know what you are worried about." The emperor's expression was slightly gentle. It was as if he felt that his son was always thinking about his father's safety. His heart was praiseworthy. After thinking for a bit, he smiled slightly and said, "Since you are unable to control your worry, then I will leave my safety in your hands." Fan Xian was surprised again and repeatedly smiled bitterly. He wondered why he had taken on such a difficult task. At this time he could not refuse and could only give thanks and agree. In a moment, come see me on the dock. The emperor knew what Fan Xian was going to do next. After saying this, he and Eunuch Hong left the manor and climbed into the carriage. Eunuch Yao, along with a group of servants and officials, also followed out. Fan Xian stood at the manor door and looked at the slightly changing light around him on the street. He knew that the Tiger Guards and the Overwatch Council swordsmen accompanying the emperor had already followed. He relaxed slightly. He waved his hand. Wang Qinian ran over from the other side of the street. With a face full of astonishment he said to Fan Xian, "Sir, the person who went earlier was—" Fan Xian nodded. Wang Qinian swallowed his saliva with great difficulty and said in a low voice, "Why is this master here?" Fan Xian's expression darkened slightly. He muttered, "No one knows why. I only know that if something happens to him, I'm done for." If something happened to the emperor during the process of worshipping heaven, Fan Xian, as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and now with the heavy responsibility of being a bodyguard, would die a wretched death. At least, the people in Jingdo would certainly put this black pot on Fan Xian's head while they would sit on the chair with a smile. Fan Xian clenched his fist and smiled bitterly in self-mockery. "I don't want to be Sigu Jian. Send down an order. Have all of the people in the council stationed in East Shandong Road move out. Be alert. If anyone comes within 50 li of Dong Mountain, send a first-level report." Wang Qinian acknowledged. Fan Xian continued, "Send the order to Jiangbei. Have Jinggu take 500 black knights and rush through the night to reinforce Dongshan Road. Set up defenses along the northwest line and coordinate with the local provincial army. Make sure there are no problems. If there is any strange movement, kill without mercy." Wang Qinian raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian. The northwest direction of Dongshan Road led directly to Yanjing and Sangzhou. It was where Governor Yan Xiaoyi's camp was. However, the two places were very far apart. If Yan Xiaoyi truly had the courage to rebel and kill the emperor, he would not have been able to move his army so far away without alerting the court. "Being careful is always the best strategy," Fan Xian said with his head down. He was incomparably angry in his heart. Who knew how many people the emperor was going to frighten by doing this? Wang Qinian accepted the order and left. A man in cloth clothing walked to Fan Xian's side and bowed. "By the emperor's edict, please give your orders." Fan Xian glanced at this person and warmly said, "Deputy Commander, you are more familiar with the emperor's personal defense. If there is anything inappropriate we can discuss it again." The security of the Qing royal palace was handled by the imperial army and the palace guards. The two systems were basically the same. A few years ago the commander of the palace guards was Yan Xiaoyi. The deputy commander was Gong Dian, who led the imperial army and guards. In the 5th year of the Qing calendar, after Fan Xian's night infiltration of the royal palace, the security arrangements of the royal palace underwent a major change. Yan Xiaoyi was transferred to the position of governor of the north. The imperial army and guards were split into two. Presently, the great prince was in charge of the imperial army while the guards within the palace were under Eunuch Yao's control. The person speaking to Fan Xian was the great prince's deputy, the deputy commander of the imperial army. Fan Xian had to be more polite when speaking to him, but he didn't waste time on pleasantries. Straightforwardly he asked, "How many people from the imperial army have come?" 2,000, the deputy commander of the imperial army replied respectfully. "They are all outside Danzhou to receive orders." Fan Xian nodded. He thought to himself that with 2,000 imperial soldiers, in addition to the numerous aces at the emperor's side, the problem of safety should be guaranteed. He turned his head to glance at the 2-story building faintly visible in the corner of the old manor and was slightly lost in thought. He remembered the first time he left Danzhou, his grandmother had once told him to harden his heart. At the same time she had once said that his mother had died an unnatural death because she was too gentle. In that instant, Fan Xian thought of the words his grandmother had said to him as she held him and the faint truths. Suddenly his heart jumped. However, he immediately suppressed it and shook his head with a sigh. Eunuch Hong was unfathomable by the emperor's side. Uncle Wu Zhu was not by his side. The Shadow and Haitang were also not here. Even with 13th Wang their power was not strong enough. Furthermore he was far away in Danzhou and had no way of controlling the movements in Jingdo. Most importantly, Fan Xian had to admit that up until now the emperor had treated him fairly well. He laughed self-deprecatingly, trying to banish the thought from his mind. The deputy commander of the imperial army did not know that he was thinking of treasonous things. He thought that Sir Fan Jr. was worried about the emperor's safety, so he had to say a few words of advice and pat his chest to express his confidence. On the Danzhou dock, the common people watching had long been chased out of sight. The fishing boats coming and going had long returned to their respective ports. The entire city seemed to have become incomparably oppressive and respectful because of the arrival of the middle-aged man in a light yellow robe on the dock. Only the floating clouds in the sky, the foam in the sea, and the seagulls flying between the sky and water did not seem to feel this kind of pressure. They continued to float and fly freely. The birds searched for food on the sea and gave out sharp cries, startling the emperor who was deep in thought on the dock. He beckoned his hand behind him and said, "Come to my side." Fan Xian, who had been watching the emperor's figure from below the wooden dock, heard these words and jumped onto the wooden plank. He walked to the emperor's side and slightly behind him. Facing forward, he looked at the boundless ocean. "Take another step forward." The emperor held his hands behind his back and did not turn his head. Fan Xian followed the order and took another step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with the emperor. The sea breeze blew and blew the hair by the side of the emperor's face back. There was no sense of gentleness. On the contrary, it gave off a sense of determination that made one's heart tremble. Below his feet, the waves were beating against the rocks under the wooden plank, turning into one snowflake, two snowflakes, and countless snowflakes. "Stick out your chest." The emperor's eyes looked at the end of the ocean and said to Fan Xian beside him, "I don't like you pretending to be a coward." Fan Xian smiled slightly. He understood the emperor's current state of mind. He followed the words and relaxed. Standing shoulder to shoulder with him, he did not open his mouth to speak. "The last time I came to Danzhou, I wasn't even the crown prince," the emperor slowly said. The emperor slowly said, "That day Qin Pingping was like Hong Xiang standing behind me. Your father. Fan Jin was like you now, standing side by side with me, bathing in the exceptionally clear sea breeze of Danzhou. Ever since I became the crown prince, Fan Jian never dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me again." Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and saw a glimmer of self-mockery flash across the corner of the emperor's lips. The emperor said with slight mockery, "After I sit on that chair and fight in the north and south, there won't be anyone who dares to stand up straight and talk to me, much less stand up." Fan Xian sighed at just the right time. That day the three of us came to Danzhou to relax. At that time Jingdou was in chaos. The two princes were secretly fighting for the throne. The previous emperor was only the unremarkable King Cheng, the emperor said indifferently. As juniors we had no way of interfering. We could only hide as far away as possible from the place of trouble. He tilted his head and glanced at Fan Xian. "In reality my thoughts are similar to yours. However, you are much more powerful than I was in the past." Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "Most importantly, the heart is not strong enough. There are some things that one does not know how to face." "Who would have thought that you would have some pity for Qing Qian?" The emperor turned his head and coldly said, "However, this is good. Back then the three of us stood on this dock and looked at the ocean. There was no pity in our hearts for anyone. We only thought about how to protect ourselves and how to survive. I often think that when I looked at the ocean that day, perhaps I was hoping that an immortal would suddenly appear on the ocean." Fan Xian was silent. He knew what the emperor would say next. "There was nothing on the ocean just like today," the emperor said slowly. A glimmer of a smile once again rose to the corners of his lips. "However, when we turned our heads, we found that there was another woman on the dock, as well as her strange servant." Fan Xian slowly said with yearning, "Actually, I have always wondered how you met my mother back then." The emperor's body shook slightly. He was slightly shaken by Fan Xian's sudden "I." Only then did he realize that this kid had unconsciously said it. Involuntarily, the glimmer of a gratified smile appeared at the corners of his lips. However, he did not continue this topic. He only said, "I told you earlier, no one has ever dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Only your mother dared. Regardless of whether she was the crown prince or the emperor, your mother dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. She looked at the ocean and felt the sea breeze. She did not treat me as someone special at all. Sometimes she would even look down on me without holding back." The emperor smiled self-mockingly and said, "After she died, there was no longer such a person in this world. I don't expect you to inherit much of what she did. I just feel that you shouldn't be too cowardly and damage my and your mother's prestige for no reason." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and thought, "This is because you are looking after the past and the present, which is why you allowed me to stand for a while. As for prestige, forget it. My life is more important. Your Majesty, let's return to the capital." Fan Xian finally said what he wanted to say. With a slightly worried expression he said, "Leaving the capital for too long as always." Seeing that he wanted to say something but then stopped, the emperor coldly said, "Say everything you want to say. You just want to say that you're afraid that someone will take advantage of my absence to have ill intentions." Chapter 520. Last night, the heaviest rainstorm the city has seen in 10 years hit. It looks spectacular, but I hope it won't be affected. Today this chapter is easy but important. The next volume will invite everyone to come back and read this chapter. P.S. Today is the day of the college entrance examination. I wish the children participating in the exam all the best. Birds chirped by the seaside, the water splashed gently under the pier, and the waves at the bottom of the cliff in the distance made loud noises. Fan Xian stood on the wooden board and was not confused by the emperor's hot-blooded words. Seriously, he said, as the ruler of 10,000 years, he will not enter an unpredictable place. I ask that you return to the capital. The capital is guarded by the Empress Dowager, Qin Pingping, and the 2 scholars. Who dares to make a move? The emperor gazed at the ocean and impatiently waved his hand. If they want to take over the world, they have to take over that chair. First, they have to kill me who is sitting on the chair. If they can't kill me, let them do as they please. Trash rebelling won't succeed in 10 years. Fan Xian was silent and speechless. He thought to himself that this emperor was truly a strange person. His incomparably powerful self-confidence and intense paranoia mixed together created this person's extremely narcissistic personality. The emperor wanted to draw the snake out of its hole. Perhaps one day he would die from his narcissism. The problem was that Fan Xian did not want to be buried with him. And Ji, you have to know that it's very difficult to see through a person's heart. The emperor suddenly sighed emotionally. One may know a person for a long time, but no one knew if he was talking about his son or his sister. Usually they are gentle to each other, but who knows if there will be a day when they will take 2 straight knives and stab each other in the chest. The wrinkles on his brows were filled that the emperor did not care who Fan Xian was sighing at. This tiredness was not the kind of tiredness he deliberately put on for his officials to see when he sat on the dragon throne in the royal court. The world may think that I am a heartless person, but they are all wrong. A kind of weariness that arose from the depths of his heart. Fan Xian quietly watched the emperor from the side and did not reply. And calmly studied the emperor's expression. I have given them too many chances through his mind, hoping that they would suddenly repent. This was the first time he had seen such a real and intimate expression on the emperor's face. If it were not for love, however, why would I need to rush about emotion was like the clouds above the Danzhou thought to himself. It only occasionally forcing people to make mistakes to test their hearts. It immediately drifted away and transformed into the porcelain blue sky. Was the emperor's actions like this? There was no longer any trace of it on the emperor's face. Just like your mother. What was left was the emperor's eyes narrowed slightly as if he felt that the sun occasionally revealing his mortal heart. Fan Xian's immediately returned to the role carefully listened to every word looking at this scene. Fan Xian could not help but him and then turned his face away. He sighed and said, "It is said that it is difficult to draw the bones of a tiger when drawing a person. For me, it can be said that my kindness is greater than the heavens." However, with a sudden change, she and her Yi family became a thing of the past and suffered a tragic death. Yet, I remained hidden and did not do anything. Although I later made up for it a little, compared to her kindness I did very little. Fan Xian understood what he meant. After his mother passed away, the emperor had endured for 4 years before he caught all the nobles in Jingdou involved in the matter in one fell swoop. However, he had left a few important people unkilled. If this was revenge, this revenge was not complete. The emperor faintly said, "I did not say it," and the 2 of them did not ask. "However, I know that they are all dissatisfied in their hearts and have resentment toward me." A glimmer of self-mockery suddenly rose to the corners of his lips. But what could I do in this matter? Without saying a word, taking the Yi family into the national treasury and accusing the Yi family of treason was heartless. But if I were to reverse the verdict for the Yi family, what would the Empress Dowager do? Or, do I have to depose and kill the Empress in order to be truly loyal? Strangely, even as the Emperor spoke to this point, his tone remained calm without a trace of agitation. It made Fan Xian, who was listening to the side, admire him greatly. Of course he knew that the so-called they, with resentment referred to his father, Fan Jian, and director Chen Pingping. As an emperor, it is impossible to wander the four seas without any hindrances. The emperor calmly said. If I really did that, I would also be a heartless person. Furthermore, what would the entire court become? I think that if she was alive, she would certainly approve of my actions. She wanted a powerful and prosperous Qing kingdom, and I did it. A determined expression rose to the emperor's face. Looking around, the Qing kingdom is the most powerful country in the world. The people of the Qing kingdom live happier than any other year in history. I think this is enough to comfort her. Fan Xian was silent. In the years after his rebirth, he often asked himself what kind of country the Qing kingdom was and what kind of person the emperor was. Although he had a deeper understanding of all of this after entering the capital and finally touched the emperor's self-confidence, narcissism, arrogance, and masochism, he had to admit one thing. Even with the flood the year before and the snowstorm this year, the efficiency of the Qing kingdom's bureaucracy, the wealth of the people, and the clarity of politics were many times better than the history books he had read in his previous life. In other words, the Qing kingdom was, without question, a peaceful and prosperous world. The emperor by his side was, without question, a wise ruler, even a saint, if the emperor's goal was to let the people eat their fill. She said that the officials of the court needed supervision. When I was still the crown prince, I advised father to establish the Overwatch Council. She said that eunuchs were pitiful and hateful, so I strictly adhered to the rules since the founding of the country and strictly prohibited eunuchs from interfering in politics. At the same time, I ordered the internal court and Taichung Temple to determine the number of eunuchs and do their best to reduce the number of abnormal people in the palace. Fan Xian nodded repeatedly. The number of eunuchs in the Qing royal palace was much less than in northern Qi. This was, without question, a virtuous policy. She said that a wise ruler should be able to listen to advice. All right, I granted the imperial censorate the right to discuss matters. The emperor spoke faster and faster and became more and more lost in thought. Fan Xian couldn't help but bite the tender flesh in his lip, reminding himself not to laugh at the thought of the imperial censorate's buttocks being flogged into streaky meat. She said that there was a need for reform and a need for a root cause. All right, I did as she said. I changed the yuan, changed the system, and carried out new policies. Fan Xian finally couldn't resist smiling bitterly. The yuan was changed in the first year of the Qing calendar. At that time, the change was actually the third new policy. The Ministry of War changed to the Ministry of Military Affairs and then changed to the Bureau of Military Affairs. The Imperial College separated into the Tunguen Pavilion. Later it was changed to the Ministry of Education and then changed back. Even the names of the 6 ministries from ancient times until now were almost changed by this emperor. The Qing emperor's achievements throughout his life were brilliant and dazzling. However, the 3 new policies in a row were absurd things that he could not avoid in his life. Even now, when the people of Jingdo talked about these yamens, they were still confused. Each time they wanted to go somewhere, they often had to report a number of names. If it weren't for the powerful deterrence of the imperial power and the valiant execution of the Qing officials, which turned the court back to its original appearance and left only those discordant names, the Qing kingdom would probably have long fallen into chaos. The emperor looked at his expression and smiled self-mockingly. You don't have to hide it. I know that this was one of the rare times in my life that I was muddle-headed. However, at that time your mother was no longer here. I only knew the gist of it. It was hard to avoid making some mistakes. Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. He thought to himself that after his mother died, the emperor still did as he was told. In terms of this intention, it had to be said that the emperor could be considered a sentimental person in this matter. Before your mother passed, I heard a lot from her. Later, I was unable to do anything for her. The emperor closed his eyes and faintly said. After she passed, I remembered all the things she once mentioned to me and wanted to help her realize them. It could be considered some kind of promise or guilt toward her. Fan Xian sighed and said, if my mother was still alive, she would certainly be endlessly grateful for your majesty's kindness. No, it is not kindness, the emperor opened his eyes and calmly said. The emperor opened his eyes and calmly said, it is only affection. As for admiration, that is even more impossible. I only want to do some things to honor her spirit in heaven. I do not wish for anything else. The emperor suddenly smiled and said, back then she used a regretful tone to speak of the newspaper. She said there was no gossip to read or interesting news to read. So, I had the internal court make a newspaper and draw some flowers on it. Now that I think about it, I was also very mischievous. Fan Xian was dumbfounded. The internal court newspaper was known as the most useless thing in the Qing kingdom. It was personally written by the scholar and great calligrapher Sir Pan Ling, and sent to various provinces and counties. It was only kept by the yamen and nobles. If it was on the market, a page of the internal court newspaper would often sell for a great deal of silver. When he was in Danzhou, he had once stolen the newspaper from the old manor to exchange for silver to spend, so he was very familiar with the newspaper. At that time, he had been very disdainful of the gossip content in the so-called newspaper and was very confused about the flowers drawn on the sides of the newspaper. The answer to all of this was, back then his mother wanted to read gossipy newspapers and listen to interesting news. Fan Xian looked at the emperor with a strange expression and forcefully suppressed the words he was about to blurt out. He had wanted to remind the emperor that the so-called interesting news did not refer to drawing a few flowers on the sides of the newspaper. The emperor did not notice his expression. He spoke more and more happily. Your mother was most curious about Pingping's story. In the 4th year of the Qing calendar, I took advantage of that old dog's visit to his hometown to have the internal court newspaper write about it. If your mother could see it, presumably she would be very happy. Fan Xian laughed loudly. He also remembered this story. In the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar, he had traveled from Danzhou to Jingdou. At the time, the two biggest things in Jingdou were the exposure of Prime Minister Lin Ruofu's illegitimate daughter and the marriage alliance with the Fan family. The second was that the internal courts were not afraid of the power of the Overwatch Council and greatly exposed the youthful story of the director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping. The sun gradually rose by the seaside. It moved from in front of him to behind him, casting the emperor and Fan Xian's shadows on the occasionally rising and falling surface of the sea. The sea water also joined in, making the waves clear and gradually calming. It made the blurry shadows of the two people become clearer and clearer. Fan Xian smiled and lowered his head. He thought in the end the emperor was immortal. Just as he could not forget the Qing temple, the emperor could not forget Danzhou. Probably in this life, only on the Danzhou dock would the emperor say so many things. It was precisely this conversation that was not between ruler and official that made Fan Xian have a slightly more favorable impression of the emperor and a deeper understanding of him. At the same time, it also added more worries. He sighed and turned his gaze toward the sea. The worries in his heart were, in the end, a matter for the future. The worries in front of him were already terrifying enough. What are you worried about? The emperor's mood was relatively relaxed and he casually asked. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, the admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy is a disciple of the Qin family. No one knew how large a guard of honor was needed for the emperor to officially go on an inspection tour. Even though the Qing emperor was known for his plain clothes, the court had put a great deal of effort into defense. On land, the provincial soldiers were outside, the imperial army was inside, and there was a group of aces and that strange old creature, Eunuch Hong. It could be called a steel fortress. On the water, a few warships of the Jiaozhou Navy had also received an edict and arrived. They were responsible for guarding against dangers from the sea. As Fan Xian said these words, his eyes were slightly narrowed as he stared at the surface of the sea, at the ships the Jiaozhou Navy had sent to protect the emperor. The emperor's expression was calm. It was as if he did not take Fan Xian's reminder to heart. He said, there will come a day when I will seek justice for you for the matter of the valley. However, General Qin is the cornerstone of the country, so there is no need to doubt him. Since you have already moved the Black Knights over, there is no need to worry about an attack within 100 li. Why do you have to be restless all day like a stray dog? Chapter 521. I wish everyone a happy Dragon Boat Festival. Eat more rice dumplings, don't be rice dumplings. There will be a new ticket on Monday, but I still haven't figured out how to do it. Everyone play for a while. I'll watch for a while. The next day the group left Danzhou at the first glimmer of dawn. Since it was the emperor's entourage, the formation was naturally not ordinary. Although all kinds of ceremonial guards had yet to come out, there was a procession of nearly 3 miles in front and behind. The densely packed crowd surrounded the large carriage in the middle that was full of noble air. It looked astonishing. The people of Danzhou knelt on the ground and respectfully kowtowed to the departing emperor. Perhaps this was their first and only chance to see the emperor in this life. As a citizen of the Qing kingdom, no one wanted to miss it. Fan Xian rode at the back of the group. With a worried expression, he looked at the group walking on the road in the distance. He was about to follow the emperor to the great Dong Mountain Temple to worship heaven. His heart was filled with unease and confusion. Last night he had met privately with Ren Xiao, and only then did he know that the emperor had chosen Dong Mountain to worship heaven, not only because the emperor had begun to miss the air of freedom, their past meeting, and Danzhou sea breeze. Rather, it was because the original plan to worship heaven in the Qing temple in Jingdou had run into difficulties. What difficulties? No one in the Qing temple in Jingdou had the right to host such a large worship ceremony. This was truly a ridiculous reason. The Qing kingdom had always believed in swords and weapons. Although they respected ghosts and gods, they kept their distance. Particularly under the emperor's influence, the power of the ascetic monks in the temple grew weaker by the day. The orthodox Chanyi Dao, led by northern Qi Ku He, was unable to enter the Qing kingdom's temple system. Meanwhile, the few remaining high priests of virtue and prestige had met with problems one after another in the past few years. First, after the great priest returned to the capital from the southern wastelands, he died of old age and illness in less than a month. The second priest, Great Master San Shi, died tragically in the woods on the outskirts of Jingdou. Fan Xian could faintly guess that the death of the great priest in the Qing temple had been secretly done by the emperor. However, if they wanted to worship heaven, they could actually go to Dong Mountain. After all, it was known as the place in the world most similar to the temple. It was the most mysterious place and the place with the most incense. But, was it only because of such an absurd reason? Fan Xian squeezed his horse's belly and followed the group with a frown. His Majesty's protection work was carried out in an orderly manner, so he did not need to worry too much. Especially when he saw the hundreds of tiger guards with long sabers sandwiched in the imperial army, he felt even more reassured. 7 tiger guards could rival Haitang Duo. What kind of concept was 100 tiger guards? He should be at ease, but he was still worried. In many people's minds, Fan Xian was probably an expert at scheming and scheming. He knew that his scheming could not be considered very powerful. In the past, he had been able to win every battle in the Qing kingdom and northern Qi because he had Yan Bingyun's help and Qin Pingping's care. Most importantly, his biggest backer was the emperor. With him as a backer, he could break through any mountain he came across. He had nothing to be truly afraid of. But if the target of a conspiracy was his backer, Fan Xian knew that he did not have enough intelligence to deal with such a big scene. He saw himself very clearly, so he was particularly careful and sensitive. Thinking of the question that had been lingering in his heart since yesterday, he felt a sliver of caution. The emperor going out on patrol was a major event. Even if he had been floating on the sea at the time and cut off his intelligence network with the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, who was in charge of Jingdou Council affairs, would certainly have a way to notify him. The internal communications of the Qinian unit had always been open. Why didn't Yan Bingyun notify him ahead of time? He summoned Wang Qinian and asked a few questions. When he received a report from the council that everything was as usual, he couldn't help but scratch his head. He didn't say anything more and smiled self-mockingly. He felt that he was too suspicious and a bit morbid. Traveling by land, it only took a few days before he saw the lonely mountain by the sea that had blocked the sea breeze for tens of thousands of years and the sunrise in the east. It stood alone and stubbornly pierced into the sky like half a piece of jade. Fan Xian rode beside the emperor's carriage and unconsciously put up a shade. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the large mountain and sighed in admiration. This was the 3rd time he had seen the great Dong Mountain by the sea. Each time he saw it, he couldn't help but sigh at the wonders of nature. How could such a magnificent sight not open one's mind? After sighing, Fan Xian also felt some pity and anger. He had lived in Danzhou for 16 years, yet he had no idea that there was such a holy land not far from his hometown. Otherwise he would certainly have dragged Uncle Wu Zhu here often to play. Although the court had sealed off the excavation of jade on Dong Mountain, it did not prohibit the common people from entering the temple to pray. If Fan Xian had often come to play, presumably no one would have stopped him. However, if he was still a child, it would not be so easy for him to enter Dong Mountain today. Flags fluttered at the foot of the mountain. Thousands of people stood in line and completely sealed off the path into the mountain. 3 days ago, the imperial edict had already been sent to Dong Mountain. The priests and monks of the temple on the mountain were respectfully waiting for the emperor's arrival at the mountain gate. The common people who had come up to burn incense had long been chased down the mountain by the local provincial soldiers. On this lonely mountain, thousands of people were silent. An oppressive and strict atmosphere enveloped the surroundings. All of this was for one person, the foremost person in the world. Eunuch Yao stepped onto the wooden frame and helped the emperor, dressed in formal clothing in bright yellow, out of the carriage. The emperor stood on the platform in front of the carriage. Without anyone's command, the thousands of people at the foot of the mountain knelt down in unison and shouted, "Long live the emperor!" The emperor waved his hand with a calm expression, indicating for everyone to rise. After being helped out of the carriage by Eunuch Yao, he naturally left the eunuch's hand. With his hands behind his back, he walked toward the newly repaired mountain gate, which glowed with white jade. Eunuch Hong followed behind the emperor. Fan Xian took a few more steps back and calmly observed the situation. Walking to the foot of the mountain gate, the priests wearing robes bowed respectfully to the emperor again. They then bent their bodies in a fawning manner and invited the emperor to ascend to listen to the heavenly edict. Fan Xian watched this scene and laughed to himself in his heart. The monks of the Qing kingdom indeed did not have as much status as those in northern Qi. The emperor did not immediately move. Looking at the magnificent mountain gate, he smiled warmly and said, "The first edict came a month ago. The exact time of my arrival was set 3 days ago." The temple's reaction was fast. "However, don't disturb the people too much. If a mountain gate is so magnificent, be careful that Dongshan Road doesn't have any silver." The priest's expressions became awkward. The head priest of Dongshan Temple explained in a trembling voice, "Your Majesty, it is only a mountain gate. The temple on the peak is the same as it was 20 years ago. It has not changed at all." The emperor smiled slightly and said, "That is good." Governor He Yongji, who had rushed over to the side to wait on the emperor, wiped the sweat from his forehead. He thought to himself that his flattery had backfired. Fortunately, the emperor's latter words had been gentle. The emperor glanced at the governor and furrowed his brows. "Didn't I tell you not to come in the letter I sent you?" Governor He Yongji was one of the governors of the 7 roads. Although his position was slightly lower than Xue Qing's, he could still be considered a first-rank official. In front of the emperor, he did not have any of the air of a major figure. He smiled bitterly and said, "It is rare for your majesty to leave the capital, and you have come to Dongshan Road. I and the officials of the roads feel honored. How could I not come to wait on you?" It was clear that the governors of the 7 roads were the Qing emperor's most trusted officials. The emperor smiled and scolded, "Get back to your Luozhou. The governor leads an army. Just do your job well. When have I ever lacked people to wait on me?" He glanced at Fan Xian behind him and said, "With Commissioner Fan following, you can go back." Yongji did not dare to object. He knew that although the emperor appeared warm, he never went back on his word. He did not tarry. He knelt down again and kowtowed. He nodded at Fan Xian as a greeting and then hurriedly led his people back to Luozhou, where the governor's manor was. Fan Xian watched with a slight smile and did not say a word. The Great Dong Mountain was very tall. Using Fan Xian's measurements, it was at least 2,000 meters. Around the mountain, other than the sea, there were plains. The contrast made the mountain appear even more abrupt and towering into the sky. If one wanted to climb it, no one would not feel a chill in their hearts. Fortunately, the side of Dong Mountain facing the sea was an incomparably smooth jade wall. The side facing the land was the accumulation of millions of years of life from the soil. On both sides of the stone steps, green grass grew. Tall trees rose into the sky. Their branches and leaves were like little green fans that blocked out the first rays of the summer sun. They danced gently in the mountain wind like countless little fans, bringing a trace of coolness to the people walking on it. Perhaps it was such a quiet and beautiful scenery that gave the common people who came up the mountain to burn incense the courage to walk the seemingly endless stone steps. Thousands of imperial soldiers stood guard at the foot of Dong Mountain. Following the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven were old eunuch Hong, Fan Xian, the minister of the Board of Rites, and a group of officials. There were also a number of eunuchs accompanying him. Over 100 tiger guards were also vigilantly scattered around the emperor. However, they did not walk the stone steps. Instead, they walked the small mountain paths which were a bit more difficult. The tens of thousands of stone steps truly tested one's willpower and energy. The common people called these long stone steps the stairway to heaven. Only by climbing it could one appear sincere and use the miraculous effects of the temple in Dong Mountain to cure illnesses. However, this trip was not for the common people to pray to God. The tiger guards walking between the stones could still hold on. Even the eunuchs seemed to have energy to spare. However, the minister of the Board of Rights, Rin Xiao, and the other civil officials could not hold on much longer. They couldn't care less about losing face in front of the emperor. Each of them held their waists and panted. Fan Xian had climbed mountains and jumped cliffs since he was a child. These tens of thousands of stone steps were nothing to him. He didn't even pant. He watched these people and found that the eunuchs beside the emperor were able to move so easily. He couldn't help but be speechless. Eunuch Hong was a strange creature. He knew that Eunuch Yao knew martial arts, but even the eunuchs serving tea were skilled. He couldn't help but feel that there were indeed crouching tigers and hidden dragons at the emperor's side. After an indeterminable amount of time, the group of people finally reached the summit. Including a few priests and civil officials, they all collapsed weakly to the ground and couldn't come to their senses for a moment. The emperor glanced at these people mockingly but couldn't be bothered to scold them. Alone, with his sleeves behind his back, he walked to the edge of the cliff at the summit of Dong Mountain. Looking at the floating clouds in front of the cliff and the sun diagonally above, his expression was incomparably calm and joyous. It was as if he had finally achieved or was about to achieve a goal. Fan Xian followed behind him and smiled slightly. He saw the emperor's chest rise and fall slightly. His face was slightly red and moist with sweat. It seemed that although the emperor's body was strong, he was no longer the young man who rode into battle. It was only for the sake of the emperor's face that he forcefully endured it. After resting for a moment, the people accompanying them began to arrange the ceremony and the troublesome food and lodging arrangements. The emperor and Fan Xian were still standing at the edge of the cliff. The father and son seemed to be attracted by the wondrous scene at the foot of Dong Mountain. They didn't say a word and only stared in a daze in front of them. In front of them was the ocean, a boundless ocean. However, the ocean they saw from here was different from the ocean they saw from the Danzhou dock. The ocean in Danzhou was close yet not easy to get close to. Rising and falling, it was close to their feet. The sound was by their ears and white foam soaked the bottom of their pants. The ocean at the foot of Dong Mountain was distant and cold. Standing at the edge of the cliff, it was impossible to hear the roar of the waves. Gazing along the jade-like mountain walls, one could only see white lines advancing wave after wave on the ocean, crashing against the stone walls of Dong Mountain and soaking the foot of the mountain, doing an eternally useless task. In front of the cliff were layers of thin and light clouds. They were like white paper, slowly flowing high and low between the cliffs. The red sun had long risen above the ocean, but it didn't seem to be much higher than the great Dong Mountain. Standing on the mountain, the sun seemed particularly close. The light passed through the white clouds and glowed with twisted and beautiful lines. Gradually, it made the pure white clouds even fainter until they almost disappeared into the air. Watch the clouds disappear and disperse, watch the rise and fall of the tide? Fan Xian unconsciously rubbed his nose and smiled self-mockingly. Why did he have to stand here by the emperor's side? Then he saw the emperor's body sway. Fan Xian was shocked. Like lightning, he stretched out his hand. His left hand opened like a cattail leaf. His fingers bent slightly and exerted force. In an instant, the coffin breaker technique was unleashed. In a flash, he grabbed the emperor's hand and pulled him back a step. Below the two of them was a bottomless abyss. If they fell in, how could they survive? After Fan Xian's heart palpitated, he realized he had been rash. He apologized and greeted the emperor. He then noticed old eunuch Hong behind him glancing at him with a strange gaze. The emperor gently rubbed his forehead. He was not angry. On the contrary, he said self-mockingly, "Looks like I am indeed old. After looking for a long time, I feel a bit dizzy." Chapter 522. Federer, how helpless. Big tears. There is truly no perfect thing in the world. How can there be a godlike existence? Today is the last day of the festival. I sincerely ask everyone for a few more monthly tickets. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He lowered his head slightly and said a moment later, "I do. Do you believe there are gods in the world?" The emperor gazed at him calmly. Fan Xian replied straightforwardly, "I do." He didn't know why the emperor was asking this question. For Fan Xian to be able to reincarnate into the land of the Qing kingdom, he, without question, deeply believed in such things as miracles. The Fan Xian of this life was not the Fan Xian of his previous life. He was a true idealist. "Come with me." Fan Xian's head was filled with confusion as he followed the mysterious emperor toward the temple hidden among the trees at the top of the mountain. The name of Dong Mountain was widely known throughout the world. At first it was known for its jade. Later it became known for its miracles. Countless commoners who had no money for treatment had come here to worship the gods. Their illnesses had taken a great turn for the better. It was also revered as a holy land by the ascetic monks of the world. In the past, Fan Xian had always thought that the Qing temple was deliberately mystifying things. Foolish women and foolish people mistook psychological consolation for true healing. Now the emperor's expression appeared very cautious. Could the Qing temple at the top of the mountain truly hear the will of heaven and be able to make contact with the illusory temple of legend? Harboring countless questions and slight excitement, Fan Xian followed the emperor around a quiet and secluded stone path and came to a particularly old temple behind the temple. The mountain wind was strong. It blew the bells under the eaves of the temple, making a clear and calming sound. It looked like the priests at the foot of the mountain had not lied. It was clear that the temples at the top of the mountain had not been repaired for many years. However, the mountain wind that had been blowing for thousands of years did not blow the old little temple into ruins. Looking at the style of the little temple's architecture and the dark and somber colors, Fan Xian's heart jumped. Involuntarily, he felt a sense of reverence just like when he had first entered the Qing temple in Jingdo. At that time the emperor had been inside the Qing temple and he had been outside. Now he had followed the emperor to a place that seemed to be out of this world. A strange feeling rose in Fan Xian's heart. The emperor seemed to be very familiar with this path or perhaps everything about Dong Mountain. Standing outside the little temple, the emperor calmly said, "Don't be curious and don't get tired of listening. The reason is actually very simple. After meeting your mother in Danzhou, we did not miss out on the scenery of Dong Mountain. We once stayed here for a time." Although he didn't know how the emperor had guessed his thoughts, suddenly hearing these words, Fan Xian's mood immediately changed. Looking at the old buildings around him, his gaze carried a sense of familiarity and yearning. However, the emperor's following words immediately shattered Fan Xian's relaxed and joyful mood. The Lord of 10,000 creations does not enter unfathomable places. The emperor laughed coldly and repeated the words Fan Xian had used to admonish him in Danzhou yesterday. "I know what you have been worried about these 2 days. Let me ask you, if you were in Jingdo right now and you were that woman, what would you do?" Fan Xian did not feign fear. Instead he sank straight into thought. He had thought about this question countless times. In the end, he realized that if internal strife occurred in Qing Kingdom and there were problems in Jingdo, the eldest princess, who was currently imprisoned in a side courtyard, only had one path to take. Perhaps she would do many things, but the center of everything, the foundation of everything, was just as the emperor had said yesterday. There was only one way to kill the emperor. First, I had to leave the Overwatch Council's surveillance and make contact with my own power, Fan Xian said without confidence. Fan Xian said with some uncertainty, "But this matter must have started a few months ago. I don't think the eldest princess has this ability." The emperor coldly said, "Do you believe that 2 people could set a palace on fire? And in the early hours of a thunderstorm?" Fan Xian shook his head, not daring to show too much emotion. Through his own channels, he had learned the inside story of the change in the royal palace a few months ago. He knew that the Eastern Palace had caught fire at that time. It was the crown prince who had done this to save himself and alert the Empress Dowager. At the time, he had only been concerned with admiring the crown prince and his brother's actions. Hearing the emperor's words, only now did he realize that there was something fishy about this matter. "I killed so many people but she didn't resist at all," the emperor said. "Yet, she still had extra thoughts in the Eastern Palace to help the crown prince. My sister's actions are always so incomprehensible. If she was able to avoid the Overwatch Council's surveillance and make contact with her people, I would not find it strange at all." From this conversation, it could be heard that the emperor had experienced the betrayal of his sister and son. Wrong. It should be said that after he had self-righteously forced his sister and son to betray him, or after the betrayal that had yet to come, his entire personality had changed slightly. He had already regarded Fan Xian, the illegitimate child who had not been by his side since childhood and had appeared particularly loyal and filial after entering the capital, as the most trustworthy person. However, this kind of trust made Fan Xian feel the pressure increase. He rubbed his slightly dry throat and glanced at the emperor. If the eldest princess had already made contact with her people a few months ago, then she only needed to wait for an opportunity. "I think that now that you are far from Jingdo, it is the best opportunity." You only need to tell me what she will do. You don't need to constantly remind me of this. Yes, I think that the eldest princess will use all of the power she has built over the past 20 years to strike like lightning at Dong Mountain or on the way back to the capital. Regardless of success or failure, she will seal off news of the emperor and falsely announce to the world that the emperor has met with misfortune and will be succeeded by the crown prince or the second prince. There's no need to say nonsense like success or failure. Since she is going to do it, she wants me dead. Fan Xian's analysis was very shallow and direct. If the eldest princess Li Yunrui could truly escape unscathed, she would certainly make this choice. The so-called plot, in the end, was still a matter of life and death, a matter of victory and defeat. As long as life and death had been decided, victory and defeat had been decided, she had the support of the princes in Jingdo and the Yi and Qin families. If she then threw the matter of the emperor being assassinated onto Fan Xian, who could sit on that throne? Unless Qin Pingping led the pitiful 500 Black Knights and rebelled again. He lowered his head and said, since the emperor has come, naturally, he has a well-thought-out plan. The emperor glanced at him and faintly said, what power can Yunrui have? The Juanshan Conference? Now that I think about it, I should have listened to Director Chen and you last year and wiped out that stupid conference. The Juanshan Conference is only an evacuation organization. Fan Xian repeated his father-in-law's reasoning. Fan Xian repeated his father-in-law's reasoning. The key is what kind of power the eldest princess can mobilize. The Great Dong Mountain is by the sea and deep within the borders of the country. It is impossible to use an army to attack. The emperor smiled coldly and said. The emperor sneered and said, the 10,000-mile stairway to heaven. If someone dares to assassinate me, they must first have the ability to ascend to heaven. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. He understood what the emperor meant. The Great Dong Mountain's position was very clever. It would be difficult to mobilize an army to attack. To the north, Danzhou's chain of tall mountains and cliffs blocked the last bit of danger for an army. Since there was no need to consider this, to assassinate the ruler of a country, especially the ruler of the most powerful country in the world, one could only use assassins. Normal people were completely meaningless. They couldn't even break through the outermost defensive ring of the imperial army, much less the hundreds of terrifying Tiger Guard aces on the summit of the mountain. Those who came did not have good intentions and those with good intentions did not come. If the eldest princess truly wanted to assassinate the emperor, one could imagine the skill of the assassins. Yi Luyun is a guest of the Juanshan Conference, Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian said silently, the eldest princess does not have many aces herself. After experiencing the attack in the valley, I feel that some people in court are becoming more and more impudent. No matter what an impudent person does, it is not surprising. He was talking about the military elders in the Qin kingdom. If these people collectively stood against the emperor, what kind of situation would it be? The emperor did not continue Fan Xian's words. He only quietly said, my personal visit to Dong Mountain this time has not only confused you, but the two scholars also strongly opposed it. Yet I still have to come. First, it is because I have stayed in the palace for too long. I want to come out and see the places I passed through in the past. Second, Qing Qian hurt my heart. If I want to depose him, I will do so openly and not give anyone any chance to say anything. Fan Xian thought about it. The emperor beside him could probably be considered the most diligent and strangest emperor in history. After ascending to the throne, particularly after the end of the major battle, the emperor had never left Jingdo again. He did not go on the routine nationwide tours of a prosperous ruler. The emperor rarely even came out of the royal palace. Fan Xian only knew of the one time he had seen him outside Taiping courtyard. The emperor suddenly paused and smiled slightly. The third reason is very simple. I purposely wanted to give Yunrui a chance to see if that Juanshan conference could actually remove me as a monarch. Fan Xian shook his head and said, it is still the same words I said before. Why take the risk? Why come here? Your Majesty is the master of the world. With one edict, the remnants of the Juanshan conference will immediately fall to pieces. They are not worth mentioning at all. Is that so? But what about Yi Luyun? The emperor smiled slightly. His brows gradually relaxed. Fan Xian was speechless. Only now did he finally understand just how confident the emperor was. He was using himself as bait. What he was plotting was none other than Yi Luyun, the guest of the Juanshan conference. The great grandmaster of the Qin kingdom, Yi Luyun. This carefree warrior who floated overseas was in the wilderness while the emperor was in court. The two of them mutually checked and balanced each other. Only then did they create a loyal yet distant relationship between the Yi family and the royal family. If the emperor was able to kill Yi Luyun with his sword, then there would not be a sliver of power within the Qin kingdom that could shake the foundation of his rule. In other words, Yi Luyun had always been a malignant tumor in the emperor's heart. He had come to Dong Mountain to use the wonders of Dong Mountain to remove the tumor. Fan Xian still felt it was absurd. Even if you had over 100 tiger guards and eunuch Hong, that mysterious old creature, if the eldest princess moved, she would certainly have countless powers to cooperate with Yi Luyun. Even if Yi Luyun failed to assassinate the emperor, given the great grandmaster's otherworldly realm, how could you keep him? He had once personally experienced Yi Luyun toppling a building with half a sword in Hangzhou, so he knew the terrifying extent of Yi Luyun's power. Unless the Qing Iron Riders formed camps and endless volleys of arrows were used, perhaps it was possible to kill Yi Luyun on the plains. However, the emperor was on the lonely peak. Yi Luyun floated here and then away. He would not give the tiger guards the chance to surround him. As for the imperial soldiers at the foot of the mountain, due to the terrain, they were unable to form a cavalry charge formation. How can one kill a great grandmaster? This was something Fan Xian had thought about for an entire year. He had come up with many conclusions. Among them, the safest was to stand 500 meters away and use the assault rifle he had hidden like a precious son to snipe him. However, this kind of situation was not easy to create. The great grandmasters were elusive. Their senses were too powerful. It was impossible for them to stand there and give him too much time to aim. How could one kill a great grandmaster? In the end, Fan Xian thought of the most reliable method. It was to use 2 great grandmasters to kill a great grandmaster. This was a very senseless and wasteful way of thinking. 2 children would definitely be able to defeat 1 child. Of course, 2 stones were heavier than 1 stone. The problem was that great grandmasters were not products that could be mass-produced. They were rare geniuses. Who could find 2 great grandmasters? Thus, I had to come to Dong Mountain because I needed a person. This person will never leave Dong Mountain to suit my thoughts. The emperor looked at Fan Xian with a slight smile. He then pushed open the wooden door of the old temple. The wooden door creaked. Fan Xian's gaze drifted over. His heart tightened abruptly. Countless surprises and the irrepressible joy of a long separation flashed through his eyes. Yan Bingyun sat in a daze in a room in the Overwatch Council. He did not sit in that secret room because the director had returned to Jingdo in a wheelchair and returned to his own room. The power that Yan Bingyun had temporarily obtained had also been returned. He was the head of the 4th Bureau. His room was facing the street. The window was not covered with black cloth. The sunlight from outside seeped in and lit up the room. Standing at the window, he could clearly see the golden eaves of the royal palace. There was no master in the royal palace. The emperor's entourage should have already reached Dongshan Road, right? Yan Bingyun thought that ever since the emperor had left the capital, the people of Jingdo had all become well-behaved and didn't give the Overwatch Council too many problems. At this moment, everyone was afraid that the emperor, who was far away from Jingdo, would suspect something. Everyone knew the emperor's main purpose in offering sacrifices to heaven. He could not have the crown prince stay in the palace to supervise the country. Thus, the Empress Dowager once again closed the curtains. The imperial army that the great prince controlled became careful. The Jingdo garrison also increased patrols. Chapter 523. After getting a rough idea of the time, Yan Bingyun closed the window and sat back in his chair. He took out a beautifully embroidered pouch from his clothes and took out a few melon seeds from inside. He brought them to his lips and carefully chewed them. He appeared very bored. Only when his gaze landed on the pouch did he become warm and affectionate. This pouch had been embroidered by Lady Shen. Sir Yan Jr. had been particularly idle these past few days. He no longer needed to oversee council affairs, nor did he need to monitor court officials with the sensitivity of the First Bureau staff. Other than the daily affairs of the Fourth Bureau, he did not have much to do. In the wilderness between Yanjing and Sangzhou, after Shang Shan, who had suffered a great loss at Yan Xiaoyi's hands, he had calmed down. Although the northern Qi people had submitted a letter of reprimand, the accidental injury investigation did not allow him to inform Fan Xian. There were no unusual movements in Shangjing, relying on his unique information was also very from 3 places. These were the things the Fourth Bureau had to manage. He began to fear before the emperor left the capital. Even if Director Qin died by the emperor's side, enough fake news to ensure the silence of both sides. That was why he wanted to go with the flow and get Fan Xian as far away from the royal entourage as possible. Even if the northern Qi royal family the director was so loyal to the emperor's tour, No
They would
matter
not
how
be
much he
able to
loved
react
Fan
in a
Xian,
short amount of
how
time.
could he place Fan
Furthermore,
Xian's
he
safety
had no
above the
choice but
Emperor's
to be
life and
relaxed.
death?
Ding
Even
dong,
without
ding
these
dong,
errands,
the copper
the
bell
Jingdo
rang.
center of the
The most
Qingyun
special
unit was still
homecoming
under
signal in
Yan
the
Bingyun's
Jindo
control.
Yamens rang out.
Logically
Countless
speaking,
hurried
for something
officials
as
walked
important
out
as
of the
the
Overwatch
Overwatch
Council
he
square
should have
building.
notified Fan
They were
Xian
not
ahead
busy
of time.
spreading evil water.
However, what he
They
did
were
not
in a hurry to
understand
go
was that
home.
once Director
Special
Qin
agents
returned to
were
the
also
capital,
public service,
he suppressed
and
this
the people in the
idea and firmly
Overwatch
suppressed
Council
it.
were all civil
This was
servants.
the question that had
They were no
puzzled
different
Fan
from
Xian and
ordinary
Danzhou.
people.
Yan
Bingyun
Bingyun
still
didn't
did
have
not
much
know
to
that
pack.
Commissioner Fan
He
had
walked
already
straight
met
out
up
of the
with the
building
royal
and sat in his
entourage.
family's carriage.
He was still faintly
Hurrying
at a loss.
back to the Viscount's
At the same
manor,
time,
he
was
didn't go to
nervous.
chat with Sister
Jingdo
Shen.
appeared calm.
Instead, he
With
went
the
directly
Imperial
to his
Army,
father's
the Jingdo
study
garrison,
and asked,
and Director
"Is there any
Chen
news
emanating
from the
a
Qin
dark and
family?"
terrifying aura.
Yan Ruahai
Nothing
glanced
major
at his
could
son
happen.
and shook his head.
If something major
"You're in
was going
charge
to
of the
happen,
4th Bureau
it should
in
be
the
at the
council.
Emperor's side.
Is there
far
any
away
movement from
Jingdo.
Xiao Mountain?" Yan Bingyun
Xiao
smiled
Mountain's
bitterly as he
location was
stood at the
special.
window and looked
It
at
happened
Tianhe
to be
Avenue
at the
below
entrance
and
of
Dongshan
Dongshan
Palace
Road.
not far away.
This place was
His
in the
position
northeast
was
of the
not
Qin
high,
Kingdom
but his
and
role
not
was
far from
complicated.
Dong.
He was
no
the third
one
most
to pass
important
through the
person
dense
in the
primordial
Overwatch
forest
Council
between
and Fan
Danzhou
Xian's
and
trusted
Zhongyi.
aide. The
However,
transportation
his
between the
father
two
had
places
another
mainly
identity.
relied on the sea
Most
or circled
importantly,
around
he was
Xiao
one of the
Mountain.
young people
Originally,
the Emperor had
there was not
personally
much
summoned
power
into the
on
palace.
Dongshan Road that could
After a
threaten
long
the royal
night of
entourage.
conversation, he had
However,
another
Xiao
identity.
Mountain just happened to
No
be on
wonder
the road from
Headmaster
Dongshan
Chen
Road
suppressed
back
him
to
the
the
moment
capital.
he returned to
The
the
most
capital.
important problem was that
Presumably,
the Yen
the
father and
headmaster
son
also
both
had
knew
some
that the
opinions
old
about
Qin
him.
master's secret trusted soldiers had been trained in that mountain. The group that had attacked Fan Xian outside Jingdo at the end of the year had been moved over from Xiao Mountain by the Qin family without the court's knowledge. Xiao Mountain has been quiet. Ever since that incident, the council has been keeping a close eye on it with great attention. If there is any strange movement, it cannot be hidden from us. Yan Bingyun relaxed slightly and sat down. Yan Ruahai smiled slightly and said, "What we know is what the director knows and what the emperor knows. Since the emperor dares to take 2,000 imperial soldiers to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, it is either because he doesn't think much of the people in Xiao Mountain or because he believes in the old Qin master's loyalty." Loyalty? Yan Bingyun sighed. Secretly assassinating important officials of the imperial court is considered loyalty? There are many levels of loyalty. Perhaps the emperor has already doubted the old master's loyalty after what happened last time. In reality, there is always a difference between an official and the emperor himself. Yan Ruahai paused and then asked seriously, "I have already retired and shouldn't ask, but I am still curious. Are there any problems in Dingzhou?" Yan Bingyun shook his head. At the beginning of the year, they beheaded 600 Hu people. They should have returned to the capital to report their success, but it is clear that Yi Zhong is also worried about the palace suspecting him, so he left the group in Dingzhou and did not return to the capital when the emperor was not present. He gently clenched the fist in his sleeve, wanting to speak but then hesitating. Yan Ruahai glanced at his son curiously and said, "You're not usually like this. If you have something to say, then say it." A faint suspicion rose to Yan Bingyun's frosty face. "I don't know if the emperor's safety can be confirmed. What danger is there?" Yan Ruahai furrowed his brows. "The Qin kingdom has 7 roads of elite soldiers. The 3 roads you suspect cannot get close to Dong Mountain. They are all under the council's watch. What about Yan Xiaoyi?" Yan Bingyun stared coldly into his father's eyes. It was as if he wanted to see something else in them. Yan Ruahai very naturally turned his head and avoided his son's gaze. "What about Governor Yan? There was a problem with the Zhangzhou victory." Yan Bingyun lowered his voice. "I said that there was a problem with the Zhangzhou victory. The secret agents searching for military contributions have already reported back. Although the heads were disguised, there are some problems. You are the head of the 4th Bureau and have taken over my job. You should know that although killing people and stealing military contributions is a major crime, it has never been completely eradicated, particularly when it comes to these border generals. They require the court's additional rewards to balance out the misery of the cold border," Yan Ruahai said coldly. "Besides, even if Yan Xiaoyi lied about his military contributions, what does it have to do with the emperor on Dong Mountain? Don't forget, Northern Qi's letter has already arrived. Would the Northern Qi people act with Governor Yan? That's what I'm afraid of," Yan Bingyun said coldly. Yan Bingyun coldly said, "If it was just killing people and stealing military contributions, then that's fine. If this matter has something to do with Northern Qi, then I'm afraid it won't be so simple." Yan Ruahai slowly stood up and stared into his son's eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "Do you know what you are saying? Do you think that just because the director and the commissioner let you temporarily take charge of council affairs, you are the most remarkable person in the world? That you can see through all the tricks in the world?" Even if Governor Yen and the Northern Qi people are acting, what problem is there? What problem? Yen Bingyun looked at his father. A fire of anger burned in his chest. He angrily said, 5,000 people died in the Northern Expedition Army. Is this a great victory? 8,000 beheaded, I'm afraid more than half of it is fake. Did those 5,000 people die or not? If they didn't die, then where did the 5,000 people who disappeared without a trace go? He pointed at the table and the non-existent map of the Qing kingdom's borders. He angrily said, Father, although the Northern Expedition camp is between Sangzhou and Yanjing, if we draw a straight line, it is less than 500 li from Dong Mountain. If these 5,000 people who should have died suddenly appear at the foot of Dong Mountain, what do we do? Yen Ruohai furrowed his brows. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said in a cold voice, Idiot! Although it is not far from Sangzhou to Dongshan Road, one has to go around Shao Mountain. No one knows how many provinces they have to pass through. The distance is also more than 1,000 li. Do you think 5,000 people can go so deep into the country without a sound? What if they don't go around? Yen Bingyun did not yield an inch in front of his father. He spoke of all the confusion that had lingered in his heart these days. If Dongyi opened its gates and allowed those 5,000 dead people to pass through the vassal states, then what? What to do two in a row did not make Yen Ruohai nervous. He looked at his son and smiled coldly. Idiot. Even if those 5,000 people had truly become death soldiers as you say, even if Sigurjian was as stupid as you to open the country's gates and not be afraid of the Qing army, have you thought about it? From Dongyi to Dong Mountain one has to pass through Danzhou. No one can climb the high mountains and precipitous cliffs to the north of Danzhou. This was the truth. It was a truth that had been proven by maps, human eyes and manpower. The primitive forests and mountain peaks to the north of Danzhou were not something mortals could climb, much less an army of 5,000 people. No one has been able to climb over before, but that doesn't mean that no one will ever be able to. Yen Bingyun thought of the geography and environment. His imposing manner weakened slightly, but he still did not give up. Straightforwardly he said, Besides, who knows if there are any secret passages in those mountains? Secret passages? Do you think this is a novel published by Dambo Bookstore? Yen Ruohai laughed coldly and prepared to walk out of the study. Seeing his father's completely unconcerned expression, Yen Bingyun finally couldn't resist. He slammed his palm onto the table with a loud bang and said angrily, I don't know if what I'm worried about is a novel. I only know that what the Overwatch Council is doing right now is there is already a point of suspicion, I will report it according to the Council's procedures. Why has the director suppressed this matter? Hearing these words, Yen Ruohai's body shook. He slowly turned around and looked at his son with a complicated gaze. Yen Bingyun thought that his father had finally been convinced by him. A wave of relief rose in his heart. Unexpectedly, Yen Ruohai shook his sleeve and left the study. Summoning his trusted guards, he coldly said, The young master is not feeling well. Have him stay in the manor to rest. Don't let him take a step out. The guards accepted the order in a low voice. After Yen Bingyun paused, a chill seeped into his heart. Staring at his father's back, he suddenly thought of the conversation he had with his father a long time ago. For a moment he couldn't speak. That day he asked his father, and I'm saying if you had to choose between the palace and the council, what would you choose? At the time, Yen Ruohai had looked at him with an amused gaze and sighed. Silly child, naturally I would choose the council. If the old director did not have this confidence in me, why would he say so much to you? Yen Bingyun took a step towards the door and was stopped by a guard who was highly skilled in martial arts. He did not put up any unnecessary struggle. He only sighed and asked his father, Where are you going? Yen Ruohai turned around and looked at his son with a smile. Since you're sick, I have to go to the council to ask for leave for you. Yen Bingyun didn't say anything more. He was loyal to the emperor and the court. He had already done what he needed to do. After all, he was an official of the Overwatch Council. As his father's son, he could not do more. The Yi family is indeed too quiet. Yi Zhong is indeed too obedient. Offering a prisoner such a good opportunity to enter the capital, yet he just let it go. Sitting in the wheelchair, Qin Pingping shook his head and said, Of course he is also afraid that the palace will be wary of him and something will go wrong ahead of time. However, the second prince must be muttering in his heart. He thinks that the crown prince is about to be deposed. If the crown prince acts blindly at this time, the second prince, with the support of the Yi family, will certainly be able to hold the fort alone. He is probably hoping for his father-in-law to return soon. Right now, everyone wants to act. No one has the ability or courage to be the first to act. The old man smiled slightly as he pushed the wheelchair over from the black cloth. If you want to destroy yourself, you must make yourself crazy. The eldest princess is crazy enough. Yen Ruahai smiled and understood Director Chen's meaning. But you are in the capital. Even if she has thoughts, she will have to wait for news from there. Chen Pingping smiled slightly and said, Our mighty emperor will certainly give the eldest princess a pleasant surprise. As for the news she is waiting for, she may never get it. But what about Yen Xiaoyi's 5,000 elite soldiers? Yen Ruahai furrowed his brows. I still don't understand this. Even if he risked his life to save these 5,000 soldiers into the country, how would he transport them to the foot of Dong Mountain? Yen Xiaoyi's actions in the Cangzhou victory were done very well. Who would have thought that Yen Bingyun would still be able to see through it? Qin Pingping said with praise. This child is truly not bad. Yen Ruahai forced a smile and said, Usually he pretends to be as cold as ice. When something big really happens, he still feels uneasy. He is not you or me. He doesn't know the emperor's plans. Qin Pingping sighed. It is normal for him to be suspicious of you and me. After the matter, how will we explain it to the palace? The emperor didn't want to beat the grass and startle the snake. Of course, the council cannot react to Yen Xiaoyi's actions ahead of time. Qin Pingping coughed and thought to himself that whether or not there would be an incident was the problem that needed to be considered. After Yen Ruahai left, the old cripple in the wheelchair pushed the wheelchair back to the window out of habit. Looking outside through the black cloth, the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. He thought that there was indeed a secret path from the vassal states of Dongyi through the mountains and through Danzhou to Dong Mountain. He knew about it and the emperor also knew about it. However, looking at it now, the eldest princess also knew about it. Even if 5,000 people went, they would only be able to surround the entire mountain peak. At most, they would be able to control the transmission of information from the sacrificial ceremony. The only important thing in this entire matter was probably on that mountain peak. Qin Pingping used his withered right hand to scratch his grizzled hair. He thought to himself that he had missed something. Fan Xian had run to the summit. He could only hope that he would be lucky and not lose his life for no reason in that earth-shattering incident. The emperor had prepared a large surprise for the eldest princess and Yi Luyun. Was the eldest princess not going to prepare a surprise for the emperor? Qin Pingping tilted his head and leaned weakly against the wheelchair. He felt the taste of life slowly leave his body. However, he became excited because of the images that appeared in his mind. It was as if he had once again found some of the elements that had made him excited and fascinated in the past. The agitation in his mind caused him to cough. Although it was an incomparably satisfying cough, it also caused waves of pain in his chest. He subconsciously pressed the secret bell on the desk, only to discover that the person who opened the door was not Fei Jie. Only now did he remember that Fei Jie had already followed his wishes and left the troublesome Qin kingdom. At this time he should already be in Xuanzhou, preparing to live the life that the old poison had long yearned for overseas. I'm coughing a little. Find some medicine to take. Qin Pingping smiled slightly at his subordinate who had just entered. If he could live another 2 years, then he would live another 2 years. The subordinate was overwhelmed by the favor and left with the order. Just as the emperor on the summit had guessed, as long as the eldest princess Li Yunrui did not die physically, she would always be able to find hidden power in Jingdou. At this moment she was under house arrest in the side courtyard of the royal family. The people of the Overwatch Council were responsible for monitoring the outside, but her life was still maintained at a very luxurious standard. What was even more unexpected was that the Xinjiang strategist Yuan Hongdao, who had fled Jingdou for many months, had appeared in the side courtyard and sat in front of the eldest princess. No one knew how the eldest princess had done it. Even a blind person can see what the emperor is thinking. However, I don't know exactly where his confidence comes from. Li Yunrui's appearance was still beautiful, and her eyes were still charming and full of emotion. However, a truly attentive person could see that there was a slight change in her state of mind. Underneath the full emotion was a coldness carved deep in her heart. Chapter 524. In the quiet side courtyard of the royal family, a guard was patrolling outside the window. He seemed to be blind and deaf, unable to hear or see anything. The eldest princess, an important target of the royal family's surveillance, was secretly plotting something with her trusted aide. He is too suspicious, so there is no need to plan anything. He will jump out and plan it himself. Li Yunrui slowly closed her eyes. Furthermore, he is very arrogant, arrogant to the point that he can beat him at his own game. What nonsense. How could there be a plan? He's just playing by himself. She suddenly opened her eyes and said, however, I am afraid that brother will be lonely, so I can only play with him. The assassination on Dong Mountain seems to have become an absurd matter on the surface. He knows I want to kill him and is waiting for me to kill him. I know he is waiting for me to kill him, but I still want to kill him. It is truly interesting. Yuan Hongdao listened to this tongue twister and looked at the smile at the corners of the eldest princess' lips. He did not find it interesting. On the contrary, he felt a faint chill. She knew that Dong Mountain was a trap, yet the eldest princess had jumped in without a second thought. Did she really think that Yi Luyun, a great grandmaster, could change the entire world? Although he had become Li Yunrui's closest strategist after Huang Yi's death, he knew that although the eldest princess seemed to have been forced back step by the emperor and Fan Xian these 2 years,
Since he could
and had
easily
never been
enter
able
this
to do
courtyard,
anything in terms
then
of
the
strategy,
eldest princess
there
must
was not
have many
much
ways
to
to easily leave this
Because
courtyard.
of this, he had
He
never
never
figured
figured
out
out
the
the
princess
details
was
of
only
the eldest
thinking about the
princess'
future
final
of the
plan.
Qing kingdom.
Naturally,
No matter
he had
how
no
you
way
looked
to
at
report it to
if
the
the
director
emperor did
and the
not
emperor.
take advantage of
As
this
a
opportunity
strategist
to
at
leave the
such a
capital
critical moment,
what chance would
regardless
the
of whether
eldest
it was
princess
for
have to
disguise
stay
or
to
to come
gain more
back.
trust?
Fan
Yuan
Xian.
Hongdao had to say
Yuan
some
Hongdao
suggestions.
tried to persuade
Thus,
the eldest
he gazed
princess.
into the eldest
Before he
princess' eyes
received
and
further
quietly
instructions
said,
from the council,
interesting. He
At
wanted to
certain
delay
times,
the eldest
it is the
princess's
combination
actions
of
as much as
absurdity and
possible.
stupidity. This is
I
your
don't know
chance.
which side is more
Fan
absurd
Xian.
and which side is
The
more
eldest
stupid.
princess became
Since the
interested
first
and
to move
smiled
was the emperor,
slightly.
then you should
Even
choose
if the
the other
emperor
path.
wants to take away
Otherwise,
Fan
no
Xian's
matter how
power
you
in the
move,
future,
your chess
this will
piece
not
will
be
always
my
be one step
opportunity.
slower than the
It is
person
not
on the
as
stone
simple as
platform.
taking away power.
The eldest
Yuan
princess
Hongdao
Li
lowered his
Yunrui
voice
slowly
and said,
closed her eyes.
Yuan Hongdao
After a
lowered
long
his voice and
silence,
said,
she said,
Fan
the other
Xian's
path,
relationship with the
you're
north is
advising
too
me not
close.
to move for now.
Once the emperor has
Yes.
pacified the
The
internal
eldest princess
conflicts in the
suddenly
court,
opened her eyes
he will
and
certainly
smiled.
point his blade
Her
at northern
smile was
Qi.
extremely
What
pure
Fan
and
Xian
innocent.
will do at this time
What's
is worth
the use of not
considering.
moving?
Perhaps
If
that
the
will be your
worship to heaven on
opportunity.
Dong Mountain successfully
So I have to
ends,
live?
there will
The
come a
eldest
time when
princess
mother will
smiled
go.
self-mockingly.
Do you expect me to
You
be
have to
imprisoned
live.
in this
She
courtyard
smiled
forever?
lazily and did
Yuan
not
Hongdao
comment.
was silent
Her
for a moment,
orchid-like
then
finger
smiled.
tapped the teacup on the table.
As Yuan Hongdao rose to pour her tea, she slowly lowered her face and thought quietly. Yuan Hongdao's thoughts were not wrong. However, he did not understand what kind of person the emperor was. In this world, only the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, knew best what kind of person her brother the emperor was. Only she knew that the emperor was giving her an opportunity. If she did not take advantage of this opportunity, there was no need to mention any future matters. The emperor had too many opportunities to kill her, but he did not. Naturally, he hoped to use her to draw out some people. The people of the Juanshan conference who had long been hidden in court, some strange old creature. She thought to herself that if she won, it wouldn't be a big deal. Even if she lost, it would be good if the emperor could achieve his goal. Thinking of this, a glimmer of a self-mocking smile once again appeared at the corners of her lips. Brother Hong, what do you think is the final competition in killing? The eldest princess looked at him with a slight smile. Yuan Hongdao thought for a bit and then said, time, opportunity, and the general trend. Correct, but also wrong, the eldest princess slowly lowered her head and said. Actually in the end, it's just a competition of the crudest, most boring and most direct things, to see whose saber is faster and who has more fighters. Fighting for the throne is actually not fundamentally different from fighting for territory between gangs on the Jianghu. The emperor is overly suspicious and thinks that he can scheme against the world, but he has forgotten one thing. Not all the knives are in his hands. Don't forget what I said before. Because of his suspicions he will, without a doubt, lose. The eldest princess' cold words set the tone for this entire matter. Yuan Hongdao smiled. He knew he could no longer convince the eldest princess, so he couldn't help but feel a bit anxious. However, he hid it well and said, the crown prince and second prince are almost done contacting them. Once the news arrives, they will begin to make arrangements. There shouldn't be any problems with the civil officials. Tragic news is always the best to strike at the civil officials' hearts. No matter what angle you look at it from, they have no reason to refuse. What you say is very reasonable, the eldest princess said with a slight smile. The eldest princess smiled slightly and said, the Overwatch Council cannot see the light. They are a powerful tool, but at times they can never become a decisive force. With only the support of the officials and the support of the palace, what use can Qin Pingping have? She then smiled slightly and said, I heard that Wan'er has been taking care of the concubine who is about to give birth. Make arrangements for this matter. On the peak of Dong Mountain, Fan Xian stood outside the door and looked at the person sitting on the prayer mat. The blind man was covered by a black cloth. His figure was not very large, but he always appeared calm. He opened his mouth but didn't say anything. The emperor laughed and turned to leave, leaving this place to the uncle and nephew. Fan Xian walked in and carefully closed the door. After confirming that no one was eavesdropping, he allowed a joyful expression to overflow on his face. He hugged the blind man and gently patted his back. Wu Zhu still had that cold expression. This coldness was different from Sir Yan Jr.'s. It was not an expression of self-protection. Rather, it was a feeling brought about by the absolute calmness of one's heart. When Fan Xian hugged him tightly and was about to go mad with joy, the corners of the blind man's mouth opened slightly behind Fan Xian's head and revealed a rare warm smile. Unfortunately, Fan Xian did not see it. Otherwise he would certainly do something strange. Wu Zhu was not someone who liked to be physically intimate with others. Fan Xian was also the same. However, meeting again after a long time, Fan Xian was unable to suppress the joy in his heart and embraced to his heart's content. The two of them sat separately on the prayer mats and looked at each other. They were silent for a long time and didn't speak. Fan Xian's expression became gentler and happier. He confirmed that the blind man's injuries were more or less healed. For a moment he didn't know what to say or where to start. Ever since they parted a year and a half ago, he had gone south to Jiangnan to fight the Ming family, been ambushed in the valley and killed people overnight in Jingdo. He had gone through countless dangerous situations. However, none of this was what Uncle Wu Zhu wanted to hear. These things were nothing to Wu Zhu. What was the Ming family? Wu Zhu did not care at all. As for the danger of being ambushed in the valley, Wu Zhu would only think that Fan Xian's performance was very poor. After holding it in for a long time, Fan Xian opened his mouth and said, "Uncle, I'm going to be a father." After hearing these words, Wu Zhu, whose expression did not change even under the pressure of Dong Mountain, fell into a rare silence. It was as if he was slowly digesting this news. Then he tilted his head slightly and said, "You're also going to have a child?" No one knew how much information was contained in this word. For Wu Zhu there were only two people in this world. Although there were tens of thousands of people, there were only two people to him. Nothing else existed. Only the matters of these two people were worthy of him remembering. 20 years ago the woman had a child. 20 years later the child the woman gave birth to was going to have a child. Although the two events were separated by 20 years, in his feeling, it was like two things had happened one after another. Thus there was the word also. Then a warm smile bloomed once again at the corners of his lips. Very seriously he said to Fan Xian, "Congratulations." Because of this smile and these two words, Fan Xian sank into boundless shock and joy. He could not understand how, after not seeing Uncle Wu Zhu for more than a year, he would say such a vulgar word and not hesitate to show his most human side in front of him. When was the last time he had seen Uncle Wu Zhu smile? Probably when he was still in that grocery store in Danzhou talking about his mother. For some reason Fan Xian's heart was warm. It was as if he felt that Wu Zhu was finally willing to smile for him, and not just because of Yi Qingmei. This was something worth remembering. Wu Zhu's smile immediately disappeared and returned to his usual appearance. Seriously, he said, "When you're going to have a child, you have to say congratulations. This is what the lady taught me. I haven't forgotten, so don't be surprised." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and was speechless. He opened his mouth and said, "This should be an emotion that comes from the heart. We don't need to remember it." Wu Zhu's face faced the mural in the temple and said, "For me this is a very difficult thing. For you, you are celebrating too early." The thin and absolutely opaque black cloth was tied around his eyes, making the bridge of his nose appear particularly straight. What he said next was also very direct. "The time is not right." The meaning of this sentence was too simple and too mysterious. A normal person would certainly not understand. Wu Zhu since he was a child, so he easily understood the meaning contained in these four words. He laughed bitterly and nodded his head, acknowledging Uncle Wu Zhu's judgment. The emperor was worshipping heaven on Dong Mountain. If someone actually dared to rebel, then Dong Mountain would be the most dangerous place in the world. Correspondingly, Jingdo would be the second most dangerous place in the world. Fan Xian was far away by the seaside and had no way to worry about the situation in Jingdo. If the eldest princess and the princes truly had the courage to do such a thing, then what kind of methods would they use against Fan Xian, who appeared to be loyal to the emperor? Wan'er was the eldest princess' own daughter, so Fan Xian was not too worried. But what about Cece and the child about to be born in her stomach? Even if the emperor had gained a great advantage on Dong Mountain, once Jingdo fell into chaos, what kind of harm would the people in the Fan Manor, the people Fan Xian worried about, suffer? This was the root of Fan Xian's shock and worry after seeing the emperor in Danzhou. However, in front of the emperor, he could not express anything. Only after Wu Zhu directly spoke of the root of the problem did his expression reveal the true emotions in his heart. It was a heavy one. The director and father are in the capital. There shouldn't be any major problems. He seemed to want to convince Uncle Wu Zhu but also to comfort himself. The emperor has not allowed Qin Pingping and Fan Jian to control the army. This is a problem. Wu Zhu's words still did not have any inferences, only results. He lowered his head and coldly said, "If you hurry back to Jingdou right now, perhaps you can still make it in time." Even if there were people in Jingdou rebelling, they still needed a reason. They had to find a scapegoat for the emperor's assassination. Thus, the time of the change in Jingdou had to be around 15 days after the Dong Mountain incident. If Fan Xian rushed back to Jingdou now, he should still make it in time. Wu Zhu said, "It's useless for you to be here." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then suddenly said, "My purpose seems to have been completed the moment I saw you." Ascending Dong Mountain and entering the old temple, the moment he saw Wu Zhu, Fan Xian understood why the emperor had ordered him to accompany him to worship heaven, why he had stopped him in Danzhou, and why he had brought him to Dong Mountain. Just as the emperor had said earlier, since this plan was targeted at Yi Luyun, he needed Wu Zhu's participation. Not only would Wu Zhu not leave Dong Mountain because of the emperor's plan, but even if he was on Dong Mountain, if he didn't want to attack Yi Luyun, he wouldn't attack. The emperor could order everyone under heaven, but he could not order Wu Zhu. Thus, the emperor needed Fan Xian's help to persuade Wu Zhu to participate in this matter. "Presumably, you know why the emperor brought me to see you," Fan Xian said with his head lowered as he looked at Wu Zhu. "You also know," Wu Zhu said. Fan Xian slowly raised his head. There was a complicated expression on his face. A moment later he said, "I've been in the capital for 3.5 years. I've done many things. In reality, I know that these things were all done by someone using me. Now those people are using me to use you. It's fine with me because I have my own desires. But you have no desires in this world, so this is unfair to you. There is no such thing as fairness or unfairness in this world," Wu Zhu said calmly. "What is important is whether or not this matter benefits you." Fan Xian noticed something strange. After being separated from Uncle Wu Zhu for more than a year, the blind uncle seemed to be much more talkative than before. His expression was much more varied. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. The emperor has thrown himself into this dangerous situation. If we don't help him and he is actually killed by Yi Luyun's sword, things will get serious. He is using his own life and the turmoil of the world to force us to help him. Even if we don't care about these two things, I have to care about the safety of those people in Jingdou." Fan Xian paused and then smiled bitterly. If Yi Luyun acts, the eldest princess and the second prince will certainly have reached an agreement in Jingdou. We can't let them succeed. Wu Zhu was silent for a moment and then said, "Speak frankly." Fan Xian sat down in front of him and said sincerely, "Uncle, please protect the emperor's life. As for Yi Luyun, don't worry about him." Wu Zhu nodded straightforwardly. Fan Xian let out a breath in his heart. The emperor could use him, but he didn't want to use Uncle Wu Zhu. He only had a few family members in this world. He didn't want too many other things mixed in. Letting Uncle Wu Zhu act did not mean that Fan Xian wasn't worried about his safety. The strange activity before the heaven worship would certainly be the greatest tremor in this land in 20 years. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu had the cultivation of a great grandmaster, he might not be able to get away with it. However, Fan Xian was not very worried because this temple was on the precipice of a high mountain. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu lost in the end, he could just jump into the ocean. With this trick, Yi Luyun and those big shots would not be able to catch up even if they whipped their horses. "I should go down the mountain right now," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. In the major event that was about to happen, he didn't have much right to speak. Furthermore, in the depths of his heart, he didn't want to follow the emperor in this crazy risk. He knew that the emperor probably wouldn't let him leave the mountain. Only by using this method of kidnapping hostages well could he move Uncle Wu Zhu to work for him. If Yi Luyun's sword occasionally turned and pointed at Fan Xian, Wu Zhu would have no choice but to act even if he didn't want to. If the other party makes a move, it will certainly be before the heaven worship is complete. In a moment, I will try to convince the emperor to let me leave the mountain. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. After this matter is over, please come find me as soon as possible. Speaking of this matter, he looked at Uncle Wu Zhu's face and asked in a daze, I don't know what is so special about the heaven worship ceremony or what symbolic meaning it has, but I am curious. Uncle, have you been recovering on Dong Mountain this year? Wu Zhu nodded. Everyone says that the Great Dong Mountain is magical. Is it true? Fan Xian looked at the black cloth on his face and asked with furrowed brows. Wu Zhu opened his mouth and said, I don't know if it's useful for those people's illnesses, but it's very beneficial for my recovery. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He didn't quite understand these words and asked, why? The yuanqi on Dong Mountain is thicker than anywhere else in the world, Wu Zhu said. Fan Xian's brows furrowed even tighter. I can't feel it. You can only feel the jinqi in your body, Wu Zhu said. The yuanqi between heaven and earth is not so easily captured. He paused for a moment and then said, Ku he once practiced Western magic. He should be able to feel it. Fan Xian was silent. He suddenly thought of the two useless sorcerers who had occasionally appeared in his life. He seemed to have vaguely guessed something, but he was unable to connect all the clues together. Magic? This was such a distant and unfamiliar term. When he was young he had once thought of cultivating magic, but on this land no one was proficient in it. Even Ku he, who was more of a collection and research of theoretical knowledge. The night gradually deepened. The temperature at the top of the mountain slowly dropped. The insects in the grass were so cold that they stopped chirping. A somber aura gradually condensed between the temples. Fan Xian raised his face in a daze and looked at the murals painted on the four walls of the temple. The pictures were similar to those in the Qing temple in Jingdo. It made him slightly absent-minded. Fan Xian was filled with curiosity toward the temple and the Qing temple that followed its style. He had wanted to ask Uncle Wu Zhu, but the pressing situation made it impossible for him to stay for too long. He stood up and bowed to Wu Zhu. Lowering his voice he said, On this mountaintop, it doesn't matter who dies but you cannot die. Wu Zhu didn't reply. He tilted his ear and then extended his right hand from his sleeve. He pressed it directly to the ground and didn't move at all. A moment later Wu Zhu quietly said, You won't be able to get down the mountain. You've convinced him. The emperor held his hands behind his back and stood at the edge of the pitch-black cliff. There were clouds in the sky, hiding the moon behind a thick layer of clouds. The distant blue ocean below the cliff was suffused with a dark color like ink. One could faintly see 1 or 2 weak spots of light. They should be the Jiaozhou Navy's escorting ships. Fan Xian walked behind the emperor and furrowed his brows slightly. In the afternoon he had almost fallen off. How exactly did the emperor train his courage? However, the situation was urgent. He didn't reply to the emperor's question. Straightforwardly he said, Your Majesty, there are riders attacking from the foot of the mountain. The emperor slowly turned around with a slight smile on his face. He didn't question how Fan Xian knew what was happening at the foot of the mountain from the top. Gently he said, Is that so? How many people are there? I'm not sure. Fan Xian lowered his head and replied, I think that since the enemy is attacking, we should immediately send out the tiger guards to break out and ask for help. The emperor looked at him calmly and didn't reply to his words. He only slowly said, I have something else for you to do. At the foot of the mountain, a fire arrow shot through the night sky with a whoosh. It lit up a bit of the sky and reported the urgent enemy situation at the foot of the mountain. At the foot of the mountain, the sounds of killing had probably shaken the heavens and blood and flesh flying everywhere. The curtains had been drawn on the most daring act of regicide in the history of the Qing kingdom. Report. The deputy commander of the imperial army ran out of the camp at the top of the mountain and knelt in front of the emperor. He quickly reported what had happened at the foot of the mountain. However, the distance between the summit and the foot of the mountain was very far. It was impossible to completely understand the specific situation with just a few command arrows. The deputy commander's face was deathly pale. He was drenched in sweat in the cold night wind. He only knew that there was an enemy attack at the foot of the mountain. This reality was enough for him to lose his head. He truly couldn't understand how these attacking troops had come to the foot of Dong Mountain without alerting the local government. Under the cover of the night, they had launched a fierce and tragic attack on the 2,000 imperial soldiers at the foot of the mountain. There was no specific content. Fan Xian watched as the deputy commander's lips moved up and down. It was like he couldn't hear a single word in his ears. It was like an absurd and laughable soundless scene. It was indeed laughable. The ruler of a country was surrounded on Dong Mountain deep within the country. The sound of killing could not reach the high summit of the mountain. The stench of blood also could not float up. The summit of Dong Mountain was still clear and bright. In the night sky very close to the summit,
the thick layer of clouds suddenly dissipated and revealed a bright moon. The moonlight was like a silver ray shining on the emperor and Fan Xian's bodies at the summit. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the emperor's godlike figure enveloped in the moonlight. He began to feel nervous and excited. Through the emperor's iron-like shoulders, he saw a small boat floating in the distance on the ocean. The small boat rose and fell in the waves. Leisurely moving forward in the moonlight, it headed toward Dong Mountain. The summit of the mountain was far from the ocean, but Fan Xian still felt the small boat. Yi Luyun was standing on the boat. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.